Welcome to Raging Bullets, a DC Comics fan podcast, episode 260. Welcome to Raging Bullets. I'm Sean Whalen, drnorge on the comic forums, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jim, the sensei of the whatnot Segulent, and the Duke of You Know. On this episode, we are joined by longtime friend of the show from Comic Geek Speak, Peter Rios, as we discuss the classic Mike Grell story, Green Arrow, The Longbow Hunters. We are proud members of the Comics Podcast Network and the League of Comic Book Podcasts. Sponsoring us this episode are DCBService.com and InStockTrades.com. Over at DCBService.com, seeing as we're talking the classics, I wanted to shout out The Legends of the Dark Knight Marshall Rogers hardcover. This is written by Steve Englehart and others, with art by Marshall Rogers, Terry Austin, and others. Cover by Marshall Rogers. Marshall Rogers' unforgettable tales of Batman are collected in this new title featuring Detective Comics 468, 471 to 479, and 481, DC Special Series 15, Secret Origins number 6, Batman Legends of the Dark Knight 132 to 136, and the Dark Detective miniseries 1 through 6. It's 496 pages, regularly $49.99, 50% off only $24.99. If you haven't read this classic Batman material, this is a great way to get in these omnibus collections. I'm glad to see that DC and just comic companies in general are doing this really cool job of coming up with various different hardcover and trade paperback solutions, whether they're oversized or omnibuses. It's just great to see comic product being delivered in a variety of different formats. And this is a great way for comic readers to kind of explore something maybe that they haven't before. Thank you for sponsoring us, DCBService.com. Over at InStockTrades.com, we mentioned on this episode the Green Arrow Year 1 hardcover. Oliver Queen has been a faithful member of the Justice League of America and defender of Star City with his trusty bow and an arsenal of deadly arrows for years. Now the thrill of the definitive tale of how he became Green Arrow is in this hardcover collection, featuring the 6-issue miniseries by Andy Diggle and Jock. This is 160 pages, regularly $24.99, 38% off only $15.49 from InStockTrades.com. Remember, orders of $50 or more give you free shipping. I want to give a quick shout out to Where Monsters Dwell. We had an opportunity to meet them in New York, and we built a really cool relationship. And they asked me to be on this week, and we talked about what's been going on at DC, all the news that's been coming out, and our thoughts about it. So I was really flattered that they invited me on their show. So please make sure to check them out. It's wheremonstersdwell.ca, and there's links right in the show notes, and it'll be on the website as well. So you don't have to write that down. Just feel free to go and click and check out Where Monsters Dwell. And I want to thank them again for having me on the show. James, what kind of a podcast are we?
We are a spoiler podcast. We go in-depth in the plotline, story twists, and whatnot of the comics we're reviewing. So if we're going over something you haven't read, you may want to come back later so you can better enjoy the show.
Carter Hall, scientific genius from a far-off world, flies into action as Hawkman.
Joining us for this segment is longtime friend of the show, Peter Rios from Comic Geek Speak. And Peter, welcome to Raging Bullets.
Hey, Sean and Jim. Pleasure being back.
We're going to be talking about Green Arrow, The Longbow Hunters by Mike Grell. And Mike Grell was the writer-artist. Lorene Haynes was the assistant. Julia Lacquement was the colorist. Ken Bruzenak was the letterer. And Mike Gold was the editor. And that Julia Lacquement, I didn't know that Grell didn't do the color work until I went back through and was looking at the credits, really deserves a high five for the color work on this particular series, because this was a stunning work. This came out in 1987, and Peter, this was something you suggested at, was it Chicago or New York? I think it was New York. You had mentioned this ages ago. Like, we should talk about Green Arrow Longbow Hunters. What was it about Green Arrow Longbow Hunters that stood out for you as something you wanted to discuss?
You know, I think it was one of those... So it takes place after... It's sort of like a thematic graphic novel similar to Dark Knight Returns. DC was had success in Dark Knight Returns, and they suddenly had this new format, this prestige format, right? The square-bound, multiple pages, more than a regular comic book format, high-priced, right? Because these are $2.95. 1987, these were $2.95 each. And they got on this kick of taking their characters, maybe some of their B-list characters, and doing stories with them that went to places that maybe they didn't go to before. And I hesitate to use the word grim and gritty because at that time we didn't call it that, and we just called them stories, right? In fact, the Prestige format there for a while was called the Dark Knight format because that was the first sort of major thing from DC that came out in that format. There were other ones for sure, but that was the one that really took everything by storm. So as they followed along with things like Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters, or Hawk World, the 3-issue Hawk World series, Fall of Adam Strange, Blood and Iron, Black Hawk, Blood and Iron, Twilight even. Suddenly these stories, I don't know, there was just something about them that felt different for very obvious reasons. And the Longbow Hunters one was something that always just stuck in my brain as 3 issues of beautiful artwork, of a story that what felt new to me. This is 1987. I was 14, 15 years old in 1987, right? And I had just started reading comics. This was 1982 in superhero comics. So this was 5 years in. I don't know. I think also some of it was that Jim hadn't read it before. And I said, this is it's a meaty story. I think it's a story that everybody always says, oh yeah, Green Arrow, Longbow Hunters, but then they never go on to say why they really like it or discuss it. So I thought, your show, perfect opportunity to do that.
One of the things, when you're talking about 1987, I was in high school for this, and I remember, you're right, it was during that whole Dark Knight time, and it was... One thing I really liked about this is it pushed the envelope at the time, at least in my eyes, with regards to maturity, which all of these prestige formats books did. And when I say maturity, it wasn't just maturity of the characters, but maturity of the format. I mean, this felt, at the time, no ads. The artwork was stunning, like you mentioned. The page quality, the paper quality. When you picked up one of these prestige format books, you knew you were in for something special. They were put together in such a way that it felt like an event. And at a time where, nowadays we're used to that term being thrown around very casually when it comes to comics. There's events every time you turn around in comics. Back then, the concept of something that felt like an event, felt special, felt different, you weren't used to this type of thing being published. And when every one of these issues came out, I was like, it didn't ignore the past of the character, because we were used to a lot of revamps going on in comics where you would redo the character. This didn't ignore any of his past. The trick arrows, all that goofy stuff from the past, which I love about Green Arrow. I always dug that about the character. None of it was ignored. This was about him getting back to the basics. And I really loved creatively that this creator didn't ignore his past. It was a part of him still. This was him much older at a time in his life where the world around him has changed and he had to deal with it. And I loved that aspect of this.
The thing I was wondering when I was reading this is, was there a Green Arrow monthly going on, or was this the launching point, or the beginning of a new Green Arrow series, or what was the deal with that?
There was a new Green Arrow series that came as a result of this. I don't remember there being a monthly. There were minis with Green Arrow, and he would appear like in Justice League, when he was on the roster, and he was a backup feature in comics, but I don't remember him having and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember him having an ongoing monthly prior to this.
No, the last thing he had been in that was his title was the Green Arrow 4-issue miniseries from 1983. It was Mike W. Barr and Trevor Von Eden. And you're right, he predominantly was a backup feature in Detective Comics. That was where he really played out. That's where he was featured, along with Justice League of America as well. But, coming out of the Crisis, which this series obviously takes place after the Crisis, and the entire DC universe is still feeling the effects of the Crisis, and DC was riding the high of the Crisis. They really were willing to take chances and were finding a lot of success. So, this character immediately after the Crisis was kind of, and during it was, a little bit shunted because there was no place for him. There was no solo title. It was just the backup features in Detective. So I have to assume that they just said, we haven't had an ongoing title with this character in a while. we could do what we want. Let's, we killed off the Earth 2 Green Arrow in Crisis. We wanted to make this one unique. Let's see what we can do. And obviously it was because of the success of this 3 issues that, as you say, Grell was able to write a very lengthy Green Arrow series after this.
Cool, because that was something I was just wondering with, because one of the things that got me on this was not only does the story that's being told hold up really well, there's like a kind of a spiritual connection to the Green Arrow we're seeing right now. And I get this great vibe of that guy in this, in Longbow Hunters is the same guy I'm reading right now in the monthly. And that, for me, was just a really cool kind of connection of through the ages.
I don't think Green Arrow has ever been, aside from like Green Arrow Year One, which is a great series, a mini-series that came out recently. I don't know if we'd call that actually a full reboot. It was more just like a retelling of his origin, but I don't think he's ever been rebooted.
No, you're right in that. This and the Green Arrow Year One, and obviously bringing in, in later years, his son would take over the mantle. Those weren't hard reboots, right? They were just sort of relaunches more than anything. There's a little. They play around with the origin even in this 3-issue miniseries. They don't quite tell it the way it's told in, say, Who's Who, but the major pieces are there. But it's just little specifics that are different. So you're right. Yeah, he hasn't had any kind of major reboot.
Well, what I liked about how Grell handled that too was really cool because he made mention of the other elements of his origin that had been told, like in Who's Who, and he doesn't discount them as being part of his lore, which I thought was something that was very interesting. Because he explains it as these were exaggerations, like the whole pirates thing and things like that. I like that Grell didn't ignore like the hard-traveling heroes, didn't ignore all that. He brought it all in a nice, neat way without also force-feeding it to you. Like, he didn't feel the need to make it an excessive part of this, which I thought was pretty neat.
Yeah, I kind of liked the variations on the origins told here. For some reason, it seemed more realistic than what we had before, and that was something that was really pulls me in to this story was the realism of Green Arrow, and just it's a character that I think I could become if I were to spend hours on hours practicing with a bow. I could actually do this, except I can't grow a cool goatee like he has, but it's still, I could be Green Arrow. And especially this character, he seems like a real person to me, and that again is another really thing that drew me into the way this was told. This is a very realistic story. There was very few far-fetched very few far-fetched moments.
In high school, I actually took archery in high school. I wasn't a big sports guy, but that was one that I thought maybe, could be something I could do. And it is harder than you just think Green Arrow, right? He's just got to pull a string, right? How hard could that be? But it's very difficult. And I was actually surprised at how difficult it was. And I know you guys, this is a DC podcast, and I almost hate to go into this territory, but there's a great scene in a Hawkeye series from Marvel in the 80s where someone picks up Hawkeye's bow, a villain, and he's kind of saying the same thing. How hard can this be? And he tries to pull the bow, and he can't. And Hawkeye explains it as the bow having, I don't know, something like 250 pound pull string or something like that. So it's an awesome sport, but I can see it's tricky. It's tricky to be an archer.
Yeah, West Coast Avengers had the scene. I thought it was War Machine, Jim Rhodes, Iron Man, who tried to pull it back.
Oh, so that might be another scene, yeah.
And had the same kind of thing where he's like, goes and is like, I was in Boy Scouts, I could do this, and he couldn't get it back, and Hawkeye just grabs it, pulls it back without effort, just effortlessly, and it's more about the mechanics behind it, and just it's not just brute force that does it. There is a finesse to it.
We see Ollie and Dinah in this series beginning a new life, and they went to Seattle. So they had a change of venue, versus like a Star City kind of thing for Ollie. It's really taking him more to a real city. something that's rooted in America, and which was an interesting twist, and it adds more to that realism that you were talking about before, Jim. And I like the fact that we've got Ollie. He's got no job. He's without his fortune. Do you guys like Ollie better as this rich playboy type of character, or do you like him more rooted in, I don't have the fortune, I've got to try to be kind of the poor guy fending for the public, the Robin Hood kind of character? I think in both cases he's played that style of character. Do you have a preference, or do you like that, it's been kind of organic for the character?
I'm actually a fan of what we're seeing here with just I don't want him to be destitute and poor, but I don't like the $1 million playboy or just the fancy, the trick arrows are cool. I'm not going to take away from that, but this character, this type, especially at the 1 year later when he came and he went and he trained, and it was more about, it wasn't just the bow anymore. He became a full, a complete weapon, and it's about shooting the arrows correctly and accurately, not relying on tricks and little, gizmos and whatnot. So I like that kind of Ollie a little bit more than, the boxing glove arrow.
Yeah, I was a fan of that 1 year later relaunch as well. It kind of upped the ante for the character, made him feel a little more, made it seem a little more believable that he could exist in this world of crazy superpowered despots if he can do more than just sling a bow and arrow. One thing about the characterization in this story, though, that kind of threw me off and I forgot about when I was rereading, is that he was a lot gentler and softer and much more forgiving, or I should say, not as gruff, not as cocky. It was a very different kind of Ollie Queen than I'm used to, especially after all these events or during the hard traveling heroes. He was a lot more liberal and just in your face, and in this one I don't know, maybe it was the whole man of the 80s thing, the Tom Selleck version of what men should be like in the 80s that was kind of inspiring this story. But I was surprised that he wasn't the Green Arrow that I was used to. And I didn't mind it at all.
I like that the villains and the people he rescued saw him differently. Like, during the bits where he was interrogating the gang, and I know I'm kind of jumping around, but I don't know how, if we're talking about how the character was different in this, you'd see him interrogating the gang, and he's shooting arrows through their hands, through their ears. Making sure not to kill anybody, because he really, throughout this whole thing, was avoiding the hunter side of himself, and that was an ongoing theme. It starts off in the beginning of this series talking about the hunter and that role, and that it was something that he did on the island, and he avoided even killing animals for the longest time. And when we talk about Shadow, we'll have to talk more about how he changed throughout this story kind of organically. But I really liked seeing that when the older couple that I'm talking about were interviewed by the police, they saw him kind of Errol Flynn-ish. Mm-hmm. And that was very much the way later on he rescues somebody and he's dancing with them in the street. And I'm like, what is Ollie Queen doing dancing in the street? What's going on with this? Because I'm with you. I didn't remember that being a part of this. And yet it somehow seemed to fit, the romanticism when he was putting that painting up in the house, in the Sherwood Florist. He had all of his guy things still packed up, which is the way kind of we do packing and unpacking. It's a very slow process. It is very much a guy thing, but there's the necessity of, I've got to have up my painting of Robin Hood. I loved those bits because it did have, you're right, like a softer side that I wasn't used to with him. I am very used to him being cocky, and I did not get that vibe from him at all during any of this.
When he dances the Lindy with that little old lady, that for me was just a wonderful comical moment, but it was also just this great kind of personalization as to who Ollie was. And I thought that was just one of those kind of moments where I was like, man, that's kind of cool seeing him sit there, and he actually was boogieing with the little old lady because she and her friend were commenting like a panel before about, oh look, the Lindy, that's what a real dance. And they were going down memory lane right as they about to get mugged by the thugs who get taken down. I thought that play out was just wonderful laid out.
Yeah, Sean, you said the right word when you said romanticizing, and I that was the word I was going to use. The whole Robin Hood myth, Errol Flynn dashing, swashbuckling character, and that was something I think Mike Grell put that into the character. I haven't read a lot of Green Arrow prior to all of this, but it was something that was definitely in his character, not only in his attitude, but in the new costume he gets, designed by Black Canary. There's just something a little more, back to the basic, as you said, rustic, romantic, and it's an interesting side to him. It almost feels like, again, sorry to dip into Marvel, when the Wolverine miniseries came out in the early 80s, and he went from this rough killing machine, this very vulgar, primal character, and they introduced this whole other side to him where he would go to Japan and fall in love and meet his love, Mariko, and all that. So it was humanizing the character, and I think that's what Mike Grell is doing very well, is he's humanizing this this character that was just a generic Batman ripoff, if you want to call it that, because he had an Arrow cave and he had an Arrow car and he was a wealthy playboy and all that. So he humanizes him and gets him back to that whole romantic notion of really being there for the people on the ground level, more so than maybe even the 70s, late 70s version of him.
Yeah, it was funny. I'll give another Marvel reference during this time. A lot of Miller stuff with Daredevil, where he was like born again and things like that. You got to see Daredevil having a personality that was a lot of these characters that you're talking about that seem to be all like they're this Batman-ish archetype, they're this type of archetype, that type of archetype. There were a lot of writers and creators out there who were starting to separate and give distinctive personality traits that separated them from other characters. We started to see you threw out Hawkeye before. There is no doubt in my mind there are distinct differences between Ollie Queen and Clint Barton. But that's because of the quality of the writers along the way who've established these characters of, sure, they both got a bow, but there's distinct qualities that separate the two of them. And, JLA Avengers and stuff like that showcase that as well. You had the two of them together, and sure, there's some similarities, but there's distinct differences as well, which is something that I think was, during this era of comics of Longbow Hunters, was happening quite a bit, and it was a great time to be a fan during this time. That Miller and Claremont Wolverine miniseries was tremendous with doing things like that. And this falls right into that category of really defining the unique qualities of this character and in his relationship at the time with Dinah Lance as well. Because she was very much into the romantic aspect of being a hero. She couldn't walk away, and it wasn't out of just a duty. It was that adventure, that thrill for it that he has with the Errol Flynn thing. And she had that same trait, and you could see what kept bringing them together during this era.
Oh, yeah. You say defined personality. I'll even go a step forward and say some of the writers who grew up with these characters, right? They grew up with these characters. They loved them. And when they got a chance to work on them, not only did they define, I think in some cases, they almost created personalities for a lot of these characters. Because up to now, Green Arrow certainly had his moment in the sun under Denny O'Neil during those Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams stories. But when he was in, say, like Justice League, he was just the blowhard, right? He was just the liberal blowhard that would go up against Hawkman a lot. So, those writers would make him a little more cookie cutter. And so he would go back to that sort of cookie cutter personality, and then it would take Mike Grell, Longbow Hunters, to ramp up another side of him. So, right, defined personalities, and in some cases, some writers would even create personalities for these characters. And I think that's another reason why we were attracted to these types of stories that were happening in the 80s in DC.
It's funny because we're throwing out terms like romanticizing, and just you look at everything that's going through, and I completely agree with that statement. But when I think of Robin Hood, because I've read tons and multiple different stories and variations in the character, you have these Errol Flynn, family focused kind of movies where he's like, ha ha ha, the twinkle in his eye and whatnot. And then you have the more realistic stories that portray him as, not this, he was a thief, but, was he actually stealing for the people? Was he stealing for himself? Did he keep a little something on the side? There's a lot of variations in the Robin Hood story, and I think that is one of the reasons that I really like Ollie's comparison to it, because of there's a lot of those variations in Ollie, where he has his moments where he is the charming, dazzling guy, or he's a little bit on the darker side, and a little crosses the line sometimes. I think that was something that I really got a thrill out of, especially the story, because they did such a heavy focus on Robin Hood.
The other thing we have to put into context here, especially with this character and this time frame, is, okay, so we've known him as the very rough character, the short fuse character from Justice League of America, and Frank Miller in The Dark Knight Returns, he took that and intensified it, right? We had a very different Green Arrow, a future Green Arrow in that series, who was, almost like the crazy cowboy type character. And so that was the strongest representation of this character that we had seen to date. And then we might have seen him in the normal DC universe before these Green Arrow Longbow Hunters issues, but that was the one that kind of stuck in our brain. Oh my God, did you see the Green Arrow, the Ollie Queen that was in Dark Knight? That was awesome. So, we're seeing a character shift here. Mike Grell is taking this character and reworking him for a new age. But then in the back of our minds, we're saying, okay, is this the Green Arrow that will eventually go on to be the Green Arrow in Dark Knight? That was a real big thing for a lot of us back then. Will the Dark Knight continuity come into play ever down the road? And if it does, boy, what does that mean for Green Arrow? So not only are we seeing all the things that we're talking about, but you're mentioning Green Arrow and Dinah and that relationship, and this is a Green Arrow that admittedly in the story is an older Green Arrow. He's celebrating his 43rd birthday. That kind of puts him in a whole other different arena next to the other younger characters. So that was the other thing that was going on here. Yes, the whole quote-unquote grim and gritty era, the DC going through all these relaunches with their characters, the prestige format, and everything in the DC universe, kind of like Kingdom Come in the 90s, everything is living in the shadow of Batman's Dark Knight.
One of the funny things about this, because you mentioned like Hawkworld, and I adored Hawkworld, which was a true reboot. It really was telling the origin of the Silver Age style. Well, it was really meant to be like an origin to the Silver Age Hawkman.
Right.
It was so popular that it ran into a series. So that's a whole different direction. But in this case, the one thing that I loved is you talk about the Englehart era, the Justice League era, Green Arrow, who had this kind of butting heads relationship, not kind of, had a huge butting heads relationship with Hawkman, which very much predates Dark Knight. But because of the way this character has shifted over time, it's funny how relevant Longbow Hunters is, because it didn't ignore any of that. It led into the series, it led into Ollie continuing on in his book, led into things like the Chuck Dixon run, led into Connor Hawke, which didn't ignore any of this. Like you said, soft reboots, the continuity's still there, we're heading in a different direction with a new Green Arrow, led into Kevin Smith, bringing the character back. Again, none of which ignored any of this, because he referenced the trick arrows all the way on back to everything going on with this character as well, into present day, which the future, the Dark Knight future, at least for this particular character, could still be very relevant to who he is, because all of those avenues of his life really existed. And you could see this guy at some point in time going down that path where he would fight with that Batman. It is funny how he's a character who there doesn't seem to be a lot. I mean, I'm sure you could find tiny little nitpicks to contradictions to Green Arrow, but there isn't a whole lot in Ollie's history that really conflicts with each other. tiny little bits, but it really is a history that's withstood long periods of time. I mean, they reference here Arsenal's child, Leon. They reference, Roy's drug addictions. All of this stuff is still relevant and present. It happened in continuity today. So everything in this, you can say, wow, this was an actual piece of Green Arrow history now, today, with all of the various intense reboots that have gone on for a variety of characters surrounding him. It's a very interesting history.
Yeah, and to go back to what Jim said about the current series, unfortunately, I'm not reading the current series. I pick it up and I flip through it just to kind of get an idea, but I kind of bailed out on it a little early, not because it wasn't necessarily because I disliked it. It just wasn't something that was catching my interest. But Jim is correct. The design, especially the feel of it, it all still kind of is reminiscent of this time period, while having its own voice. I think it was trying to move away from the 1 year later stuff and him being mayor and what would happen with the wedding and what would happen with the rise and fall of Arsenal and all that. So I think they felt that they needed a new direction, not quite a new direction, just maybe a direction that took a little bit of a turn. But it's a you could almost even say the same thing about Black Canary as well in this series. They reference that she has a new costume, and in this series she wears, for a little bit, she wears the old costume. And her story, what happens after this, gets played out in Green Arrow, gets played out in Birds of Prey. It is something that she references to this day, the sort of traumatic, the very traumatic experience that she has in it. So, unlike some of the other relaunches or more mature storyteller, however you want to describe this prestige format stuff, Longbow Hunters, you're right, it does survive. It's a little bit friendlier to the character than some of the other titles.
You talked about the relationship with Dinah. We talked about the romanticism before. One of the things I also liked about this was it also played the other side of the coin, which, I was 16 when I read this. And, I was reading it now when I was 40 and kind of experiencing being a hero through the eyes of these characters and how they're talking about how the DC universe got darker. There is that overtone in this, that this is a world that they know if they had kids. They bring up, Ollie's like, I want to marry you. I want to have a future with you. I want to have kids with you. And that was like the whoa. And you got Dinah coming from the standpoint of, and I really liked the fact that it was her, not Ollie, saying that she didn't want to have kids. I thought that was I remember that always being something that stood out to me as an interesting twist, to have a female character not doting after the guy to say, we've got to have kids. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mean that, the maternal instinct of a female. I know they play off of that a lot. But it was interesting in this case to have her be the one to put on the brakes and say, look at the life we lead. We lead a very dangerous lifestyle. And she, plays out all the romantic pieces we talked about, but also said, I don't want to raise kids who are going to be orphans. And it could be you, it could be me, at any point in time, as long as we are downing these outfits. And, she was pointing to him in particular because he seems to be the more active of the two. But she's got a need, a desire to be a part of that still as well, which we see in this that gets her into trouble. But it was interesting to have her put on those brakes, and I really liked that because I didn't remember growing up. I always remembered you wanted to be a hero. Heroes always defeated the villains. You didn't really talk about the negative aspects. It wasn't something that you saw a lot in comics, and it was when it was refreshing to start seeing those things discussed. It added a realism to this world for me. At a time, I'm in high school, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, whoa, wow, how cool is that? This feels relevant now.
It's funny, when I went through these, and a lot of these just dialogue back and forth between Ollie and Dinah, had I read this back in 87, I don't know if I would have enjoyed this as much as I enjoy it now. Because nowadays, I'm sitting there as an adult, and I see just this conversation, back and forth dialogue between the two of them, and it's, again, thrown out of the term, realistic, very, normal. It was just this wonderful, back and forth banter, and multiple times. Like the beginning of the book when they're cleaning out the Sherwood florist and they're taking down the newspapers and just the general banter, chit-chat back and forth when the whole proposal thing. There was just so many human moments that I didn't have as a kid at that point in time. I never really had any type of relationship like these two would have that I could actually pull a realistic experience from or association. So that's part of it. I'm glad I'm reading this now, not back then.
Let me touch on that, though, because I read this back then, and I didn't have those experiences either. And Dark Knight Returns, think about it, I wasn't a retired guy, but your focus tends to be more on the cool, it's like Batman's back, and then when Batman's in the costume, Batman's running around and, doing these incredibly acrobatic and violent things. And with Green Arrow, it was, he's shooting arrows through people's earlobes and through his hands. But yet there was a mature story in there as well. So while I couldn't relate to them from the standpoint that I hadn't, reached that age bracket yet, there was a universal... And like I said, I read it at 16. This is right around when I was reading Dark Knight. There was a jumping on point, I think, for anybody during that era that wasn't. You would have been surprised because a lot of my friends in high school were reading comics and who were more casual. And when I say more casual than even you, that were like picking up this series and loving it, and they really jumped on this from Dark Knight. Dark Knight was a launching point to this format for a lot of people, where they were going into comic shops because Dark Knight was a media buzz that was insane at that time. So I don't know that you wouldn't have focused. I did focus more and identify with them more this time around, which I really found refreshing. But I think there was a lot of content in this that you would have focused on in a different way, probably more of the action sequences, because I remember that was something that I found particularly breathtaking in this, was the focus on his training and this idea that he didn't just one day wake up and I'm Green Arrow. There was actually a process to this guy becoming, and I thought his vulnerability was something that I identified with at that age, because Peter, actually when Peter was talking about I didn't do a whole lot of sports and things like that, but I tried archery. I was the same way. I wasn't a big sports guy in high school. So to see Green Arrow admitting that, like, this whole thing on the island with the pirates and stuff like that was just a happy accident, these guys happened to be stoned and I came upon them. I'm like, that vulnerability to him when I was 16 years old was something I found refreshing in a way to identify with a character. There was a human aspect to this superhero. I'm like, well, maybe I could do this. And he made it sound like fun. Even though there was the dark twist in it. So there was something, I don't know, that was exciting. I don't know what kind of experience you had with it, Peter. If it's similar to what I'm saying or if it was a little different. But I know there was something about this that I think just worked back then at a younger age.
Yeah, and again, I was a little young. I was just a year or two younger than you were reading this. And, I'm a firm believer that context is king. Not as an excuse, but to throw people back into that time period. 86, 87, those were great years for DC. Yeah. If you were a DC reader, you were loving what they were doing because there was energy and excitement and it felt fresh. So, you had Dark Knight. You kept seeing the house ads for this thing called Green Arrow, Longbow Hunters, Mike Grell, beautiful artwork. There it was on the stand. And when I was reading this at the time, there was some things in it that it definitely felt different from what I was reading in normal DC, in their normal title. The story, because of the whole drug trafficking side of it, there were no superpowers in it. You add in this twist of this new character, Shadow, who brings a whole lot of history with her. They reference different wars. So it felt adult. I don't mean in sexuality or anything like that. It just felt a little more sophisticated than what I normally was getting at the time or what I was normally drawn to. So there was that little barrier that as a reader I felt that barrier. It's a little more sophisticated. It feels like older people having an adventure. It probably feels like what younger people today, when they see their parents watching like Law and Order or CSI, right? They're probably like, oh God, Mom and Dad, not that show. There's some of that feel in this because of the nature of the story. So then you add to the fact that, and Sean, I don't know how you reacted to this, but when Green Arrow says that he's 43, and you're 15, and you think of these characters as being maybe late 20s, early 30s, and all of a sudden he ages himself, that really was awe-inspiring. I was like, whoa, 43, wow. Suddenly your brain just starts to go, okay, well then he's definitely got to be older than Batman. So what does that mean? Did he start later in his career? How does he get to be 43? How old is Black Canary? And she's one of my top 5 female characters in the DC Universe. I love Black Canary. And, I got to throw in that, along with all that stuff we're talking about, seeing a lot of the sexuality that he brings into this it's not like it was titillating or anything, and I wasn't like I was trying to see this as like a copy of like Playboy or something like that. No, but it made them feel like adults, and it made me feel like I could look up to them and it made me feel like they were no longer just silly comic book characters. They were people. They were people that had real lives, that had real thoughts, that had real problems. And there was some criticism at the time, and there's certainly criticism today, where people say, oh, they just do these stories because they're trying to make them grim and gritty or dark, or they're trying to make them appeal to 40-year-old men, But I was 15 at the time, and I wasn't feeling any of that. It wasn't like I was giggling along with it, like it was like I was in on some secret. I was really caught up in the lives of these stories, and that was really why it had more of an effect on me at that time than anything else. So that energy, the sophistication of the story, the sophistication of the art, that being a DC reader, I was reading everything at that time, but DC going through this major expansion at the time, you almost couldn't pass it up because everybody was going, oh, did you get Dark Knight? Did you get Green Arrow, Longbow Hunters? Did you get the new Superman reboot? Did you get the new Wonder Woman? Did you get the new Hawkworld? You almost had to, or you felt left out.
It was funny when you were talking about that at the time. One of the things that I was liking was the comics. I didn't feel comics were talking down to me, or that they were assuming that I was a dope. Because I was at this time, I grew up my whole life being a DC fan. I was also reading Marvel. I was into Claremont's X-Men. And especially those early years of Claremont's run where, he was doing a lot of stuff with Byrne, and after that, where we saw things like the Dark Phoenix saga and things like that. And then Storm's leadership of the X-Men that you saw during this time. And you talked about like a sensuality. There was a sensuality in that run of X-Men where it was the same thing of what you're talking about, where they were sexy women, but you didn't lose this idea of strength, and that they were, Storm was the leader of the X-Men, and that for me was an alien concept, and this idea of respecting that these females were strong and that they could run the team and that they would be deferred to. I thought it was a great thing that was going on in comics. That was, and it was totally believable to me. I wasn't, at no point in time did I say, what, they did what with her? I was totally just went right along with it because of how fluid the writing was, and how it was so explained that this person was the right person for the role. So then we're back over in DC, and DC's telling stories like Longbow Hunters and Dark Knight Returns, where we're getting into this concept that these characters have now an age assigned to them, where before that was something that wasn't really explored too much, unless you were talking about Earth 2, where you knew that in Earth 2 Batman got married to Catwoman, because of the JLA, JSA crossovers, and you knew like certain things that they aged over there, but we didn't really have a time frame, so to speak, in the DC universe proper. Now we're starting to have it assigned to characters in current continuity, where we're like, well, Ollie's this old, and you were, and I think Dark Knight was something that I think gave an accessibility to telling stories about these characters being more mature, because Dark Knight was such an older Batman. Way older than Ollie Queen in this. This is definitely a retired Batman who had been out of the game for a while. But I think then when I approached this, it was like, okay, we've jumped back a few years now. Ollie's not ready to hang it up. He's just more mature. And he's got to rethink himself and his place in the changing DC universe. And it was a cool commentary on how the DC universe that I grew up with as a child through the 70s has changed, because it really did change in a short stretch of time post-Crisis. We got to see a maturing of the villains, them killing or, being more dangerous. It wasn't as happy-go-lucky. There was some real danger. And to see an old hero, one of the old guard, in this series reacting to that and trying to say, what is my role here? What have I forgotten about my basics? And saying, the trick arrows aren't going to get me through this. And to see him using a bow and arrow and making it so believable in this as it being an effective tool. The way that there's bits where, they're shooting bows and arrows at each other and slicing through each other's lines. And, it was just such a cool way that there wasn't a point in time during this that I'm like, I want to see a boxing glove arrow. Yeah. And I'm a fan of that stuff, so I'm not knocking it. So don't take me wrong when I say that. As a longtime fan of this character, I never felt any of what I've always loved about Green Arrow and the more cartoony aspects of the character. I never felt any of that was missing here. This felt like the same guy, and I got him. I liked that about the whole thing, and I never felt that it was inaccessible at 16 reading this character. And I'm with you, Peter. I thought that the fact that he's 43, there was something cool about that these stories all happened. They weren't isolated. It wasn't month in, month out. These are isolated stories. They don't really continue or progress. This was progression, and it was cool.
With him and his age, the thing that got me in this story was seeing him really get his butt kicked a couple times, especially that first time he goes up against the tunnel rat, the slasher. That guy got him completely, 100%, got him from behind, jumped him. It was... Ollie got completely taken down. It was Shadow who ended up putting him down, and I thought that, for me, when I was reading through that, I was like, wow, that was a cool moment for me, because I'm sitting there going, Green Arrow didn't get the bad guy. Dragon Lady got him. And I thought that, for me, was just something. And then as the story's going on, you keep seeing more of his internal dialogue with, oh, stupid old man, and it just the references he makes to himself when he makes, some physical mistakes because of his age, or when he had to soak in the tub because of, he's a little bit sore after being on the streets. Those were just some moments that when I was reading this, I was like, man, that's a really cool thing. I like that.
It's funny, reading this during the time, none of us had any budgets. So when you read this, you read it multiple times, as it was going through. You read a lot of times the single issue when it came out multiple times, like issue 1, read it multiple times. So after the story was done and you went back and reread this thing, it was really cool to see that there were multiple mysteries that were laid out very early in the series. Like Dinah was going on her drug trafficking case, and Ollie was on this slasher serial killer case. But then Ollie's case took a turn where there was like a copycat killer going on as well, and you were wondering, like, Dinah's case, did it play into all this, or was it just a way to give her something to do to show that she was still active? And then to find out as this was going on, we got introduced to this Magnor guy. His role in the military played into the slasher killings, played into what Dinah was going through in this big corporation, was all, and Osborn and the government being brought into it, and the corruption. It was all very much a layered story where there were multiple threads that like seemed disconnected as you were reading. They seemed to be going off in different directions, and they all converged. And to go back and reread this, at 16, I went back and reread this, and I'm like, what? They did what? That was another area, too, where I found this intriguing, because it was a story with multiple layers on it that when you went back through and saw how it was all laid out and how the clues were placed there, I was blown away by that. Because it was great because you figure I'd been reading comics since I was a little kid. To see a comic that was now at 16 taking me in a mature direction. When I say, like Peter's saying, I'm not talking about, titillating or anything like that, making me think and notice and think beyond the page, where I'm wondering things that we don't see in panels that were happening because of so much going on in this story. It was something that I really appreciated and really loved. Like, I wanted to know more about Shadow. Like, we don't see her entire life. I wanted to know more about her life as this series was unfolding. And that was something that I really found refreshing about all this, was just how much more I wanted to know when I was done with all this, and how much I appreciated the intelligence of it.
Yeah, when you're talking about just with Shadow, that for me was just a great play out of a brand new character origin. Just you get a little bit here, a little bit there, and it was just this nice piece by piece by piece by piece building on it that I really just, and it was also even just not just telling the story, but the connection to the actual current, connection of the past to the present was another great thing. That, when in the beginning, when they're, when her sensei's teaching her about patience with the shot, how you just have to wait, and you're not taking the shot happens, and just going through all that, and you see that spider slowly starting to weave the web, and it's just the patience of waiting for that right shot, and that spider is present day when she takes out the one guy. She was holding that pose so perfectly steady that a spider could actually spin the web there. That for me, I was like, dang, that is cool. That was just a nice usage of past, present, future, just this great zen of who she is. I really, right there, those sequences really have you going, this is a cool character.
She's one that I think balances nicely. Grell used her very nicely as a balance, and you can tell that he has personal interests in a lot of the things that you see in this miniseries. Nature, the wilderness, talking about some of those aspects that you're talking about with her character. They've played out in other titles that he's created over the years, and with her character especially. I mean, that just opens up a whole new world to Oliver Queen, and I'm sure we'll probably touch on some of the after effects of this miniseries, and I'll save my thoughts for later. But we definitely do see her more eventually, and to this day. And there are some things that I like that has happened with her character. There's other things I don't like, but for this initial impact, she didn't steal the show away. She just becomes part of the story. A smart writer doesn't let this kind of character just run away with the story. She becomes part of it, and she becomes part of the Green Arrow mythos from here on out.
It was a great way to illustrate this thirst that hunters have. And this, because they were talking about that with an early premise for Green Arrow in it, this idea of being the hunter, and how once you've got that, it's hard to let go of, and how Ollie had to fight to let go of that, to the point where he wouldn't even hunt animals. And I loved when they had the first meeting between him and Shadow. They showed his eyes, and they showed her eyes, the close-up shots. And I loved it, and I'm going to jump over this one, because later on in the story in issue 3, we see them meet again after all of the events that have transpired. And an Ollie who has crossed that line back into being a hunter again. And you see it in his eyes. And it was something where it was a great marriage of art and character development through there, where Shadow recognizes the change in him. But I love that we see it so early on, and we see a gentler Green Arrow, and she noticed it, that he would not kill. He would not, and those were moments that she had with him where she recognized that he didn't have that hunter in him at the moment, to be that person. And I loved seeing her training montages, which this does take it back to the point we're at in the story right now. Those training montages where we saw where she was developing these skills and how much she went through without knowing, because early on in the story, we didn't know what was driving her. We knew that there was a vengeance there. We knew that, there was something that she was hunting these people down, that she was the Robin Hood killer. We didn't know why, though. We didn't understand the premise behind it. And to see her training unfolding, and then to gradually see what drove her to want to quest for her honor back, as she referenced in the story, was something that I'm like, wow, I'm really captivated by this character, not knowing, is she going to be the villain? Because there was points in time when I remember when I originally read this, I'm like, is this the major villain in the story? Because Green Arrow does reference her as being better, and I'm like, okay, is he going to overtake the person that's better than him, or is he going to have to confront her? How is that all going to play out? Is Black Canary going to team up with him, and is he going to take the two of them to encounter each other? I remember as a kid, wondering, where is this going to go? Because you had 30 days, or more. I don't remember if these came out on time. Because it wasn't uncommon with the Prestige format during that time for there to be a little bit more of a release in between them. But I do seem to remember this coming out relatively on time, if it wasn't exactly, at least, what we call a 30-day standard. And I just remember in between each issues, thinking a lot about where this story could go, which to me is a sign of a good comic, that you care enough to think about it when you're done reading it, and care enough to try and figure out where these characters are going to go. I loved her introduction, because you're right, Peter, she didn't steal the show, because we know enough about Ollie, and he really is the one we're journeying with. And that's really important in a Green Arrow story. You have to feel like the whole time, with whatever plot development they're doing, that you're journeying along with your main character, the one we're supposed to be rallying behind. And sometimes that does get lost in comics, where you don't always have that kind of relationship with the character. This is a great example of where Grell really had a lot of balance in this, because he was doing a lot of things, and I don't feel that ever lost journeying with Ollie with everything that he was doing in this. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree on that, but I thought that was something that was a strength of this.
Oh, definitely.
I'd agree with it. Yeah.
Yeah. This was one of those. And you talk a little bit about just the thrill of the hunt. That Ollie explains how he's fighting it. That is a real, very realistic interpretation and explanation of that moment when you're sitting there and you're hunting and you finally kill whatever you're going after. You have this moment of just adrenaline that hits you, and it takes you, even like while you're doing the shot, you got to fight that off, but that's part of practice and your training. But after the moment, after the shot's fired, you get this rush of hoorah, I got it, and you got to start, okay, focus, calm down, what I got, and you just got to bring yourself back down. It takes you a couple minutes to even think through, and add to it, if you're starving on a desert island, that would even, take it a whole nother level if you're, if you have that hunger, raw survival instincts to add to it. I loved that scene where he's talking about how he didn't want to get into that, because it could be very, very addictive.
I keep forgetting you hunt.
Yeah.
Because it's not something I do. It's not something we share in common. For all the years that I've known you, I've never gone hunting with you. It's not it's not an interest of mine. And I don't mean that in an insult in any way, shape, or form. It's a difference that the two of us have as friends. Being somebody who does hunt, did you feel a connection to this from that aspect?
Oh, big time. Big time. Because I remember, first deer I got, after I shot, I was like, I got it. I got it. And I literally was sitting in my spot going, oh, okay, what do I do? And I had to think, what do I have to do now? And I had to pick up my gear, go get the deer, start dragging it. I had to go through, cleaning it out, and which is a nasty, nasty, non-fun process, by the way. Some people enjoy that, and I'm like, okay, you enjoy that.
This is why I don't want to hunt.
It's one of the reasons. But there is that, there was that adrenaline. I had a grin from ear to ear, on my face, probably for a good 3 to 4 days. Because every single time you find somebody new, hey, guess what? I got my deer. Got my first deer. Oh, cool, yeah. And you keep reliving that moment. And it's one of the things that with me, I only hunt when I'm going to eat. I don't hunt for sport. I don't do any of that kind of stuff. It's not for me, because part of me is a little worried I'll enjoy it too much, and you could go a little bit too far with it. So I kind of have my own personal limits on what I do hunt, what I won't hunt, and just where I go with it. But there is those realistic kind of feelings that you get, that it's not even just the moment of the hunt, it's the afterwards when you're sitting around the fire drinking a beer, and just jaw jacking with everybody you went hunting with. There's so much more, and it was something I kept pulling from this, and I kept seeing this, and I kept saying, he's got the hunter mindset down here.
I was scared during part of this when you were talking about the bowstring and all that. I thought, I'm like, Jim's going to start hunting me or something as we're talking on here.
I stopped doing that years ago.
Yeah, I didn't it was something that just clicked when you were so passionate about, with him with the pulling the bowstring and all that. I'm like, oh, wait, I keep forgetting Jim hunts. Dinah was doing this search for the drug traffickers, and she gets captured. And when we see that segment that Peter was talking about, where not only the sensuality of the two of them alone together earlier on, where we got to see a very sexy side of her, where she's coming down in the Black Canary outfit, but we see that torture sequence with hers, which I remember being something that I don't want to say jarring, because that is a negative connotation. I remember it was something I was surprised by, because it was something that I hadn't seen from a main character. Because Black Canary was somebody who I'd grown up with. So to see her put in that position was something where I was like, wow. It was funny. This was a change this time around for me. With how much I've grown to love the independence of this character, this former leader of the Justice League of America, in a run that I really enjoyed, with her having that leadership role, her role in Birds of Prey, seeing her overcome Savant when she was being tortured by Savant and working her way through that. It was something where this time around I wanted to see her, and I wish she'd had this isn't a knock on Grell. This was a Green Arrow story, and his focus was on Green Arrow, so this isn't a negative on the story. I think it's my love for the Black Canary character. I'm like, boy, I wish Dinah had a chance to get the one-up on these guys and come back and do that. But it was only because of who I know her as now, not back then, because I never felt that when I read it back then. It was interesting, though, to see that I do feel the character, Peter mentioned it earlier, who's in Birds now, and all of that journey that Dinah has gone through after this series very much was an after effect of this. But it was when the torture sequence came on this time around when I read it, I'm like, ooh, I would have loved to have seen her get a chance to get the kind of vengeance that we're seeing Ollie and Shadow get in this series. I don't know if you guys experienced that during this, or if it felt any different to you that time when you saw that sequence, or if anything jarred you differently. Not jarring, but I mean, felt differently to you this time around, knowing what you know now about any of these characters.
The question I had, and I was going to ask you guys this, did she still have the canary cry when this was going on, or was that something that came later, or, because I'm not 100%, up on how she was in 87, what her character was like, what her power set was.
So she was, the costume that we keep referencing in this series is the usual fishnet little bolero jacket type thing that she normally wears with the boots and all that, so and the little jumpsuit. So that was the costume that she wore for the longest time in the Justice League, and right before this series started, she was a member of Justice League International with that crazy bird-like costume that some writers like to joke about to this day. The one with the crazy shoulder feather things and the headband and the white boots and all that. So she was in that costume over in Justice League International, and she most definitely had the canary cry. That was her thing. She had that power from when she was a kid, and although you don't see it in Longbow Hunters, she does have that ability. So then, let me sidestep into what Sean was talking about, and then I'll get back to the canary cry thing. So I thought Grell really used her character in a way that very much honored where she came from. Okay, so she says she doesn't want to have kids. She believes in what they do and what her and Ollie do as heroes. And if you know her story, her mother was the Golden Age Black Canary, and she is this Dinah Lance character. She's a legacy character, especially post-Crisis. Now, post-Crisis, DC had this thing where they didn't really want to mention too much about the JSA. They didn't want to mention about their World War II heroes because they had shunted them off into limbo during the Crisis. So that's why you don't really get Dinah saying anything about her mother. I noticed at this time, I realized, she's not really referencing that her mother used to do this back in World War II. She's just saying that she enjoys the thrill of being a hero. And if you read Mark Waid's and Barry Kitson's Justice League Year One, you get a real strong sense of what it means, what it means to Dinah to be Black Canary, taking over from her mom. When you read the James Robinson, Jeff Johns JSA title, the one that was just called JSA, not Justice Society of America, she felt honored to be in that JSA because her mother used to be a member of the JSA. So, he got that part of her right. And her saying to Ollie, I'm going to do this on my own. Don't worry about me. I'm going off and I'm doing it. And she didn't have to fight with him. She didn't have to plead with him. That was just their understanding of each other. So that, those first two issues where she really gets hit hard by this whole drug thing going on in Seattle, she takes care of it because she can. She's a very established, experienced hero. So then you get obviously what happens to her and the torture sequence, and I know it's been used in some people's arguments of weakening the character, of sort of like an attack on female characters, and Sean's right. Ultimately it is a Green Arrow story. You obviously, as well as he uses the character in the first and second issue, yes, I can see that using her as a tool in the story to push him and to push Shadow. Okay, I get it. I can get that criticism of the story if that's where if someone wants to call it that. But that Sean's right. That impact of seeing her like that, tortured like that never happened to any character. Batman might get shot a little bit, but it never put him out of commission. Superman might get a little kryptonite, but he always bounced back. Here was something that was a defining moment in her character, and was a real shock. Wow, this is happening to an established superhero. That was huge. That was huge for my eyes, anyway. And I didn't think it was grotesque, or I didn't think it was an abuse of power on Mike Grell's part. It was what it was. And then it was up to writers afterwards in DC, to sort of use that character and see where she would go. And she had her own miniseries, and she had a couple of miniseries actually, and then she had the Green Arrow the ongoing series, and then it finally took until Birds of Prey, the one shots before the ongoing series, where they finally said, okay, we got to do something with her, and put her back into a place where she deserves, and through Barbara Gordon and through Oracle, they both helped each other find their new way. So she did have her canary cry, and it was because of this event that she actually lost her power. Not only did she lose her power, but we also would find out that she also lost the ability to have children. And it was a weird sort of twist. We just had this conversation about she does not want to have children, and then she can't have children. And I think eventually down the road, obviously, if you're reading current comics, you know that she has her Black Canary power back again. I think there was a Birds of Prey story where she got thrown into a Lazarus pit, and not only were her powers restored, but I also think her ability to have children was also restored as well. So this time she was a superhero, but because of these events, that was all taken away from her.
And it's funny because when I read this, because I didn't know which way it was going, and I was able to come up with a justification in my head with scenes that we didn't see that occurred, how she would get into that. Because I started thinking about the canary cry, and that's a power that takes a little bit of prep to. If she gets jumped from behind and they keep torturing her and bleeding her out, because when she's in the hospital, they talk she lost a lot of dramatic amounts of blood. If that's constantly going on, she's unable to focus, and you basically do a full breath to get the blast out. So with me, when I was sitting there reading this, I was thinking that, but I was able to almost instantly understand how she could be in this position, and it didn't take anything away from her being that, being bound and tortured because of the nature of the villain she was up against. That was a really sick son of a gun who knew what he was doing. He wasn't just some thug who would let her, give her a moment to rest and recuperate. This was a guy who was constantly on her, who kept doing the slow, drawn-out torture. And when you get that kind of, perfectionist or experienced, monster, you're not going to be able to use your power blast. You're not going to be able to get away from it. And it's, for me, story I was able to create off page completely explained everything and didn't take away from it.
Well, what I really like too is the work of Chuck Dixon and Gail Simone, just for example, and Birds, when Peter was referencing the one shot straight on through to present day. I like that they didn't cop out and ignore any of this. I mean, in the sense that this is a character who's been through a great deal of tragedy. And to me, I think part of the strength of her nowadays is that she's overcome all that and found a confidence and found a power to the point where she built herself up to the point where she was a leader of the Justice League of America. And now to the point where when I read Birds of Prey, I feel that Birds of Prey, that team, is, very much a top-tier squad. in the DC universe. Black Canary and Oracle, when they're together, the ultimate buddy cops. And that's not taking away anything else from any other members of the team, but it's something about those two, the longevity of Birds of Prey. The only time really those two were separated was when she became the leader of the Justice League. And then, the Green Arrow, Black Canary series and all that was going on during that time. After all that went down with her and Ollie and she went back to Birds of Prey, this character hasn't lost a beat through that gradual growth. And Peter's right. Through Oracle, she found that something, but it never ignored this. And I think that's really important because this is a huge event to do this to a main character, and Black Canary to me is, Peter was referencing her as one of his, top 5 DC female characters. And, she is a rich, long history in the DC universe. This is a major character to do this to. And there's got to be some kind of repercussions to it. It's got to matter. These events don't bother me as long as they matter. If it's dropped, and then that's where it's just for shock value. And it didn't mean anything. This meant something to her. It played out in her life. Whether you liked it or not, it's something that mattered, and I give writers credit for not ignoring it, because I think it is something that I love looking back at events like this and feeling like very similar to what happened to Oracle in Killing Joke. To Batgirl in Killing Joke, I should say. She wasn't Oracle then. To Batgirl in Killing Joke. These are horrible things that happen that these characters became stronger because they overcame it. And I think it's cool to see the parallels between those two characters. Say, wow, these are two characters that went through 2 nightmares in a very similar time in their lives and somehow found a connection. Maybe not even realizing that they were at the same times of their lives, but there was a connection that these two gathered from all this. And I really liked looking back at this and seeing that, and that it wasn't just left here.
Yeah, and you can certainly say about I can certainly see people's criticisms with what happened to Barbara Gordon in the Killing Joke as being something that was a little more for shock value because there was no real build-up. It just sort of happened, right? And in this Longbow Hunters one, there was a build-up. I mean, they have a conversation in the beginning about the lives that they've chosen to lead and that it is dangerous. If you're going to set that up and then you show it, well, that's not shock value. That's kind of following through on the life that you're giving to these characters. And Mike Grell was he didn't want superheroics in his comic, in his Green Arrow comic, right? He didn't want people in costumes using their powers. He wanted it a little more grounded. He wanted Green Arrow's universe to be something that kind of would make sense for a guy who just had bow and arrows. So that's why you didn't get a lot of costumes or supporting characters or powers. It is that follow through. There's some people who say, "Oh, these characters never change; they're the same characters every time you read them." Okay, well then a writer comes in and he tries to do something. Then it becomes about, it's always about grim and gritty. Why do they always have to do that? Or it won't stick. It'll change. Well, that didn't happen, right? Black Canary was powerless for a long, long, long time, and whether you agree or disagree with how it happened, whether you think it's another case of just a writer beating up on a female character or whatever, it was dealt with, and I don't know. I never saw this moment in this book as bad. I never thought it was cheap. I didn't think it was, an exploitation of the character. And yes, I'm not a female. We're not females. We don't know what that feels like. I get that. I totally get that side of things. But story context, it is there, and it was something that did play out. Now, in the ongoing Green Arrow series, I did get a little annoyed that Black Canary kind of became a second banana to some of the other females in Green Arrow's life. She got a little more beat on eventually, and that got a little tiring. But that's when I felt that it was just sort of writer laziness. I didn't think that Longbow Hunters was lazy writing at all.
You know what? It's funny when you're talking about that, too. One of the things that I like about continuity, because a lot of times, you know, one of the criticisms people have about continuity, oh, it's so hard to jump on a character when they have this rich, long history. The characters had histories when we were kids and we jumped on them. There were stories before. I have not read every single Green Arrow story ever. I've read a lot of Green Arrow. Longbow Hunters especially. I mean, I was reading Green Arrow before this in the backups, and I read him in Justice League, but I hadn't read every single one. Got to admit that. Read Longbow Hunters. I jumped on the series after this and read it for quite some time. Totally agree with what Peter's saying about how after this, Dinah does get beat on. And it's, again, though, an easy thing to do with Dinah would have been to reboot her after this. You know, I mean, I'm talking about after the Green Arrow series and all that, to reboot the character. An easy thing to do with Ollie would have multiple times been to reboot the character. Not soft reboots, talking about hard reboots where we're going to start over from scratch and give you a brand new Ollie and all that stuff. What I've thought has been great about continuity, when you talk about there's never any change, the writers that have cleverly taken these two characters, and if you look through their history, these are two characters that have changed. They've changed multiple times, but it wasn't because they took the easy way out and rebooted them. I think it's a lot harder for a writer to kind of take everything that happened to them before and find a way to say, they went through all of these things, and I'm going to gradually show you how they're becoming this. You know, and this is where I see them going. This is where I've always wanted them to go. This is where I've always thought these characters had potential. And rather than ignore anything that happened before, I'm going to find clever ways to use that to show you how they got from A to B. And that these events did matter and that it's a part of their core makeup of who they are. And it's something that I find that's a distinction. And they're not the only characters in comics history that have had this happen to them. But I thought it was something with DC characters where previously we'd seen these characters kind of in that never-changing holding pattern. They've got, this is who they are, and we've never seen any progression. Seeing the growth of these two characters from Longbow Hunters on, you know, everything in their lives that has happened to them, all the tragedies that's happened to them, Oliver Queen dying, all of these things mattered to these characters. And Dinah constantly references the abuse, not only from this Longbow Hunter series, but that Peter was referencing in the Green Arrow series as being a destructive part of the relationship. And it took her a long time to believe that Ollie could be somebody, when she did eventually marry him, that she could marry because of that guy. He had to really convince her when there came a point that he did change, that he wasn't that fellow anymore. And I think that's an interesting distinction between these two, that all of these things happened and that they did evolve, they did change, because people do that. We have various events in our lives that change us. Peter and I both read this when we were teenagers, and we aren't the same guys that we were back then. There's core elements that are there that are the same, but we've gone through a whole bunch of stuff between the two of us that are, you know, changed us as people all the way through, we hope. But, I mean, it's great to be able to take these characters that we grew up with, to view them now and think about where they are today and look back at this story and say, wow, they did similar journeys. And I think it shows how clever some writers can be in comics. And I think it's a lot harder to do than doing a reboot. I really do, to evolve these characters and make it feel like that all that continuity matters. And that's one of the things that I love about serialized storytelling in comics and continuity, is when you can look back and see these events and have them matter.
Amen.
Yeah. I'm in full agreement. And I also think we as readers, we can tell when writers are being very honest about these characters and using where they've come from to tell their story, to tell a better story, to tell a fuller story. You don't have to reference every single story that these characters have been in, but if it helps to jumpstart into a new way, that's great. And the opposite of that is when a writer in maybe one or two lines kind of snarks on a past event and pokes a little fun at it. You know, I can tell when that happens very clearly. You know, a writer just will make a joke about something, some previous event that has long been pushed under the rug or whatever. And I don't know, that to me feels disingenuous. It just doesn't feel like they're playing along, and that to me feels more jokey and more cliquey and club-like than trying to reference or trying to make sense of the continuity, right? Some people say that oh, if you try to stay too hard to continuity, you're just being a fanboy or whatever. But I think making fun of it is even more fanboyish than anything else. Just making a quip about, I don't know, I can't exactly bring up a good example, but when I see it, I'm always like, really, writer X, you kind of have to joke around about that. That's just be a writer. Don't be a commentator on a comic book when you're actually writing a comic book. So that kind of stuff annoys me a little bit. Sean, have you ever heard of the Silver Age Justice League curse?
No, I haven't heard that reference, but
it's not something that's a huge thing or anything. But there came a point, like from late '80s to the early '90s, that almost every satellite era Justice League character had something tragic happen to them, and the death of Superman, the breaking of Batman's back. You had Aquaman lost his hand. The whole continuity mess that was Hawkman. Red Tornado went through a bunch of changes. I'm trying to think who else. Certainly, Barry Allen, Flash died, and all this stuff. So there was just. I remember reading an article somewhere along the line that every single satellite era Justice League member had something happen to them, and they put in there, the tragedy that happens to Black Canary. Eventually, later on in the Green Arrow series, there's that whole thing where he quote unquote dies. So they put that in there as well. And I don't know, I always felt that was kind of a cheap way to put the Black Canary thing in, because it's not like this was a stunt. This wasn't an event book that like Nightfall. It wasn't like, I forget what the Green Arrow one was that led to his so-called death. It wasn't, Doomsday. It wasn't Wonder Woman, the contest, right? Like that was the thing she went through where she had her mantle taken away from her. So it felt sort of like cheap to put the Black Canary thing in there, because I thought the story, it was a story. This was a story that he really wanted to try to tell, to try to reinvigorate the characters and see where they could go from there. So I just brought that up because it was a thing that was going on in the late 80s and 90s, and that was sort of Black Canary's path in it.
Well, Green Arrow had become like a terrorist towards the end of his run, and it wasn't until he had a confrontation with Superman and really had to make a decision who he was at that moment, and the reason why he died was because he chose the side of the angels, at the end. I mean, it really was making a decision to say, wait, who am I and what am I all about, in those moments. And it was an interesting end to his run, because he really kind of lost his way. So it was talking about, you're right, that was a pivotal thing, and you're right, Wonder Woman, the contest, and you can even argue the death of Hippolyta down the road, and Diana's gone through a lot of nasty things. Hal, you're right, Hal Jordan.
Parallax.
Yeah, Parallax.
Oh, right, I forgot about that one, yeah.
That's a huge...
Hope this craft can withstand this powerful force.
One of the things that got me, that I really enjoyed in this, was because we talked about the torture and we talked about that sequence, but we haven't really talked about how the torture sequence ended with the kill shot.
Oh yeah.
And that was something that whenever I look at the heroes and I think about, should heroes kill, should they not kill, I always, on one hand I'm like, yeah, I can see that. On the other hand I'm like, I need them to have a higher standard, and I always reference it's got to be how it's told in the story. And for me, this was a great telling of a kill shot. This was, it so fit in where Ollie's mind was, what he was going on, because he was in a major panic, really, turned up the intimidation factor, and pretty much beating people up for the information to find where she is. And then he finds her and sees the conditions she's in, what's going on. I thought that was just a great, boom, just split second, the hunter instinct in him kicks in and he fires the arrow. And I thought, for me, that was just a really cool sequence, and seeing just even everything play out when he's breaking into the place, because he kills that one guard dog. And he has a moment of remorse. You can see it because he had to kill the dog.
Did he kill the dog, or did she kill the dog?
Remember, Shadow was running around too.
See, I thought Ollie took out the dog, because that's how I took it. Because I was always thinking to myself, I thought that was Shadow. Did he have more remorse over killing the dog or killing the guy?
Yeah, she does. He was just about ready to shoot, and then he looks at the dog, and there's an arrow with a white feather.
Oh, okay.
That's Shadow's arrow right here.
Okay, yep, I stand corrected.
Ollie's first kill was the guy.
Yeah. Well, that's good then, because I was a little upset that he did kill the dog. So I was more upset over the killing of the dog, and I was glad to see him reaction.
And actually, his only kill during that sequence was the guy.
Yeah.
Because it was funny, because we didn't really talk about him at all, Lieutenant Cameron, who becomes, first he's kind of a police adversary to Ollie because he doesn't like this new vigilante being in the whole area, and really, the two of them are butting heads. Ollie's got his brash, and one of the things I really did like about that segment, I totally agree that this was a step away from the cocky Ollie, but you see elements of that in his relationship early on with Lieutenant Cameron. It softens as the two, reach a point of mutual respect, especially after what happened to Dinah. But it was funny. I love that Lieutenant Cameron wasn't a dope. He recognized that there was some kind of relationship there with Ollie and Dinah, that there was some part of him that was invested in this. No matter whatever level it was, he wasn't buying Ollie's story to the point where he pulls up the arrows, the ones that are like melted, and he says, somebody, if they were really looking at this, might see that there might be different kinds of arrowheads in here, and and he was basically letting him know, I know, you were a part of this too. It wasn't the Robin Hood killer, because Ollie had before this been preaching the arrows are different, and this is somebody you need to look into. And with Shadow, when he was basically trying to uncover the mystery of the Robin Hood killer. But this time around, this guy knew that, hey, wait a minute, you were flinging arrows around too, and you are responsible for a kill shot here. And Cameron gave him I don't want to say a wink and a nod because that makes it very tongue-in-cheek, but it was more of a sense of respect of knowing, I get whatever happened here with you was very personal. I also get that these people were very bad, and we're looking at, am I going to do any good by punishing you here? Which I thought was a very mature thing at the time too, because this wasn't black and white, good is good. This was shades of gray. And there's points in this where you have to look at that and say, is Ollie a hero in this? Is he a vigilante? And is there a distinction? Because we really do see in this series more of an identification of what it means to be a vigilante. You are operating outside the law. And Ollie in this is crossing the line and operating outside the law. And that's not a criticism. I actually really liked that about this. This is an Ollie who took the kill shot. I get why he took the kill shot. It was the right thing to do at that moment. Is he a hero at this point or is he a vigilante? I'm leaning more on the vigilante end, but I loved kind of having that philosophical distinction with the guy, because I do think there's periods in Ollie's life before and after this where he's just a hero. I think in this he's definitely a vigilante. And I liked that relationship with Cameron and how it played off of that and how Cameron started to see the need for that. Or at least was saying, I'm watching you, I get it, watch yourself, keep skirting that tentative line. If you go over the edge, I'm getting you, kind of thing between the two of them. I really liked that depth of that relationship, that they were really pushing back and forth with each other. And I respected Cameron as a character in a very short development period in this series. Everything, like Peter was saying, was there for a reason. Nothing was just shock value. There was a big story being told here as far as what does it mean to be a hero, what does it mean to be these adventurers, what does it mean to be that. And that was another character that added to that for me in a weird way, and I liked it.
Well, to bring up Jim's point about the kill shot and some of the things you're saying, Sean, this is a character, especially after this series, and especially in some Elseworlds. I was actually just reading, or flipping through, I should say, Justice League The Nail and Justice League Another Nail, and poor Green Arrow in that series gets a little beat up on. But he was the one that would constantly reference things like, I can't fly, I don't have superpowers, I can't run through walls, I can't see through walls. So there he is at that moment, seeing the love of his life being tortured. He doesn't have super speed. He doesn't have a super brain that he could come up with 20,000 different ways to free her without hurting anyone. He just did what he's able to do, right? He is an emotional character. He's a passionate character. He always kind of skirted that line. Well, not really skirted the line, but if any character had it in him that he was going to kill for defense of himself or someone else, I mean, that's the character that's going to do it. He'll justify it by saying, look, I can't save Lois Lane from a falling building because, I can't save Iris Allen by running really fast. I can only do what I can do. And at that moment, that was it. That was it for him. He had to make that choice, and he made the choice. It was either her or him. And that, he had to do it. So this whole push of putting him into that corner and making him a vigilante and making him someone who will kill if that is something that he needs to do. Does that take away from him being a hero? I guess some people can argue that. Does it make sense with the world that Mike Grell is trying to create? I think so. And does it push? When Identity Crisis came out and the villains in the DC universe really, they started to ramp up a lot of the villains and Villains United and things like that. One of the things I kept saying is, these are villains, right? I mean, at some point, doesn't it make sense that they kill? Because they are bad. They are supposed to be bad. So on the flip side of that, Green Arrow is only human, and you can only push those human boundaries so far in a world where people can destroy planets, and to make sense of it all, he has to put on a green costume because that's the only way he can fit into this world. So I don't know if it's right, I don't know if it's wrong, but I certainly understand his choice. And I like that it is something that was in his character, but then it was also something that he would have to kind of live with for a long time as well.
Peter, I've got to correct you on one thing. Villains tie you up on a giant birthday cake. They don't kill. And I'm joking because I actually love that story. But you're right. It was something, I think it's a nice progression that you get to see that the DC villains, they're supposed to be these lunatics. There's also some of them that are supposed to be smart, conniving, and truly downright evil. So you're going to have a variety of different situations that arise where you're going to have to deal with people that will kill. And also, the stories like this started to get away from it having to always be super villains. These are characters who are, real. We're dealing with people who are doing drug trafficking, arms trafficking, a slasher, and all of it kind of comes together from these guys who were war veterans who, were watching out for each other and then found a way to profit from the system. And these are people who are grounded, who, yes, they would kill to protect themselves. They would do everything they can to protect everything that they've built up over this time. And anything that might get in the way of it would be something where, first of all, before we kill you, we're going to get every ounce of information we can from you because we want to know who are you working with and what do they know? Because who do we need to take out to continue to keep our secret? So this shows a multi-layered villain who is very smart in saying, we can't just kill this girl. We got to know what she knows because, does she have backup? And in a world where we saw earlier on with the slasher, police officers who were dressing up to try and victimize themselves to capture the slasher. So we're in this kind of world where it's normal to have undercover cops. So why wouldn't they? And we saw again, showing that this wasn't just a throwaway thing with Black Canary. We saw an undercover cop killed earlier in this series. So it was something that there was a reference point that it wasn't just Dinah Lance who went through this in this world. It was something that happened with another undercover cop who was going through that. So I thought it was interesting to see this kind of reality brought in, and where it wasn't a Black Manta or a Merlin, for example, coming in and doing this. This was more of a character that was grounded in a sense of reality at a time where we would see this happening in the real world.
Yeah, I did enjoy the fact that when Ollie was by Dinah's bedside, that he was having nightmares from it. He was having, the bad. There was the remorse that he was feeling. And it's, when you talk the vigilante hero debate, that for me is the hero factor of Ollie. Whereas the vigilante, I wouldn't see them losing much sleep over killing that scum. Ollie still has that hero nature. He still has that, it's not right to take a life, but I had no choice, but there's still that guilt's going to eat at him, and you see it manifest in the nightmare. I thought that was I was glad to see that.
I guess what my distinction was, and I'm not saying this is a negative on Ollie at all. It's just the opposite. It's something that I like about him. I think it's a distinction between him and Superman. In that sequence of events, and it goes actually a lot of what Peter's saying, Superman would not have killed in this sequence, but Superman had the powers to end it differently. Whereas Ollie doesn't, so as a vigilante, he takes the step to do this. It's where he becomes the hunter again, and he gives into that side of him, and does something that Superman wouldn't do because it was only recourse. And I'm not saying that I think that he was wrong for doing it, or I morally am questioning him. I would like to think in that situation, if it was my wife and I had no other choice, I would take the kill shot too. I mean, you're talking about, you're trying to defend the person that you love over letting them fall to this horrible person that's doing it. But you're right, and I liked that there was an after effect in issue 3 in the beginning where it wasn't just Ollie saved the day, he carried her away, and Shadow kind of gained a connection to him because of a common tragedy they went through. Because obviously Shadow was connecting this to what happened to her dad, which we'll go into. I liked that moment. I'm glad that it didn't end there, and there was actually, like you said, these flashbacks for Ollie of, wow, what did I do here? And this matters to me, and it bugs me. I don't know, do you call him a vigilante? Do you call him a hero? I don't know. I do think there's a distinction between him and a superhero, though, like Superman, and I like that because he should feel different, and it sets him apart, and I think it makes the universe more interesting and more colorful.
Well, yeah, I mean, the DC characters, I mean, a lot of them are icons, a lot of them are archetypes for all the characters that follow. So when you do a more grounded story, they have farther to fall, right? Their status is huge, not only in the DC universe, but in just the iconic nature of what it is to be a superhero. Superman, that's a huge pedestal that character's on. Wonder Woman, Flash, and even Green Arrow as one of the first bow and arrow type characters, right? These are things that don't happen to the DC characters. They don't have faults. That's not what makes them heroes. They're heroes because they were born to be heroes. They weren't created or they weren't forced into it by a happy accident. Most of them. I'm talking about sort of, like the big Justice League major characters. So when something like this does happen, when a character is pushed into such a situation, that's where you get some of the negative, or you get feedback where they say, oh, heroes shouldn't do this. And it's not something you don't hear a lot with the Marvel characters because they're based on faults, right? They're based on the Marvel fault of Tony Stark being too cocky, or Doctor Strange being too arrogant as a doctor, and he loses the use of his hand, so he becomes Doctor Strange. So when they do quote unquote bad things, it's not that it's part of their nature, but they're a little bit closer to those events than the DC heroes, So then you get that aspect with a DC hero, and I think that's why it's so shocking to some people, because these characters are treated as almost like the iconic superhero model of all superheroes. And then when you get a story like this, you get a story like Identity Crisis, it bristles people and it makes them a little more confrontational to it. But I find it to be a little challenging. Maybe there are stories to be told, and the story was out there, right? So you can't ever argue and say, oh, well, that story shouldn't have been told. Well, guess what? It already was. We have the 3 issues sitting right there. Okay, so now how do you reconcile that 3 issues? You can still not like it. I don't care. You can like it. You can not like it. That's up to you. But the story was produced. So now it's a question of how do you make it work? How do you make the character, his choices, how do you make that work into the larger frame of comics and his history?
And I prefer, like I said earlier, without rebooting it. Make it, if you didn't like it, because a creator can come on afterwards and go, I didn't like what they did with Green Arrow there, I didn't like what they did with Black Canary there. I honestly have a lot more respect for creators who say, I'm not going to ignore this. I'm going to show you, how the character can grow from this, or I'm going to put the character where I always thought they should have gone, or whatever. I mean, and that's a way that I prefer to see stuff like this handled. Kind of touching on where we're going with this, and it's something I left out of my discussion with Lieutenant Cameron. I really liked, and this is where Ollie becomes, in my eyes, the vigilante shows heroism. He could have let this whole event just crush him, and he sits there with Dinah, which a lot of people would, and rightfully so. You go, oh my gosh, after the trauma he went through, he's understand him sitting there. He saved his girl, he saved the day, pat him on the back. Wow, incredible what he did. He doesn't stop there. Through his conversation with Cameron, he's realizing there's something big going on here. These dog tags that are there, he's saying, okay, sure, you're right, Cameron. These could have been just picked up anywhere. This guy could be a fake, he's a poser, whatever. Instead, he's saying, but what if somebody is powerful enough, or a group of people are powerful enough to hide the military records of these people? Who could do that? And, it asks a very scary question. What kind of power are we really dealing with? And rather than ignore that, he's like, my next clue to this is Shadow. I need to start finding out who this Shadow is. Does the research into the tattoo, which starts bringing in this whole Yakuza history that could be, going on through this whole thing. And we start to get more of her background and know why she has this vendetta against them because of what happened to her dad, who was entrusted with this $2 million, which at that time, $2 million is huge now, but $2 million back then, she's saying this was an incredible amount of money. And he did the honorable thing and held on to it until his family was put at risk. He had no choice but to give it up and killed himself because of the dishonor that he brought on his family. And this put her on this quest, this dishonored person through this family tradition of honor. I need to get my honor back. And these guys, these military guys, took this from me, this Magngor and, the Slasher and all these guys. This is why I'm hunting all these people down, is because they took my honor away. And it's these stories converging, seeing that her origin is directly tied into this thing that Ollie, just because they moved to Seattle, was brought in. Ollie and Dinah are victims of circumstance because of just where they happen to move and who they are as people. They got brought into this whole event that had already been... Shadow's situation with them would have happened no matter what. Ollie and Dinah were only involved because they happened to walk into Seattle when all this was going on.
Bad timing.
Yeah. And to me, where Ollie becomes more heroic was that he didn't let it drop there, because he would have been justified to do it. I don't think any of us, as friends of anybody that we know that did this, we would have still patted him on the back and said, you saved your girl, man. Look what you did there. This is fantastic. But what makes a hero is that they, tie the boots on and they continue finding a way to finish what they started. And Ollie here is realizing, I'm not done. I have not finished what I started. I set out at the beginning of all this to make it right. Dinah set out at the beginning all this to make it right. We didn't know that our two stories were going to converge, our two quests were going to converge, but I am going to continue her quest. I'm going to continue my quest, and I'm going to bring, some form of closure to all this. And that's where he starts to be, heroic, vigilant, whatever you want to call him. There is a heroism to that, to finishing, taking responsibility and finishing what you started, legal or not.
Some of the cool Batman stories are the ones where they bring in the mom to it, and I always like that because I've always enjoyed mob stories. But when someone gets the whole, Yakuza, when they get that whole mindset and just the concept behind them down correctly in a story, that for me just takes it always up a notch. There's you see so many, Italian mobs, Irish mobs, the various other ethnicity, mafiosa, but just the whole concept of that these killers and these murderers would still have this code of honor. There is still this code of conduct that they have to adhere to. And I loved seeing that, with her father having to commit harakiri, with her, even though she was just this small little baby when all this occurred, but now now the dishonor falls on her to rectify, for her to take, to clean the family honor, and for her to continue on with, just get this vengeance. I really just ate that up, just seeing everything play out, and especially when we really finally get some of the final pieces of the puzzle, and you see how scummy these guys are that she's taking out. You sit there and go, okay, is she? What is she now? Yes, she's this killer for the Yakuza, but you know what? There's a code behind her. She's a conduct. She takes out, the slasher. She saves that one lady, who was about to get killed. She does have this, presence and just sense of right and wrong in her dealings with this. It's not just about the kill of these bad guys. There is a higher calling, but is she really, how much of a difference is there between her and Ollie? And that was the thing I really enjoyed exploring as I'm reading this, thinking and looking at the two different characters.
One of the bits I really loved in this was the old woman who was turned out to be Shadow in disguise, who was giving Ollie some information to talk about, oh, she gave me the $2, and she gave me this, and I overheard her say this, and all that stuff. And you see her, she's walking away with the tattoo on her arm. I thought that was a neat little... It was a wink and a nod to the reader, and I'm always a fan of that in comics, where you can do that. We know something the main character doesn't. Ollie didn't know at this point that he was dealing with Shadow. We did. And I'm always a fan of that. I dig that kind of thing when they do that. I thought it was a clever placement for that.
Now, did you guys think that was Shadow before they showed you the tattoo?
I don't know if I don't know if I can go back to when I was 16 and remember whether or not I knew right away. I don't know, Peter. Did you remember knowing that at the time, or?
I don't remember at the time, but I know reading it this time before I saw the panel with the tattoo on it, I almost thought, wait, is that Batman? Is that Dark Knight scene where he walks into the market as a like almost like a crazy woman yelling about the ketchup or something like that? It felt like I don't know what it felt like, and it kind of took me by surprise that this kind of calm, sometimes cold character was putting on this little bit of an act. This acting. It was like one of her great acting moments, and I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if he really did know, if he caught on, did he not know. It felt a little jarring this time when I actually read it. I hadn't remembered that at all. I thought it was a little different from the character, but I mean, they do talk about the whole blending into the shadow thing, and I don't know, maybe that's her way of blending in, right? Like, become part of the environment, not only the natural environment of the mountain and the trees and all that, but the urban jungle that's sort of referenced in issue 1 and the city and all that. So it threw me a little bit for a loop, because I really did think, wait, that's not Batman. No, who is that? So I was kind of thrown off.
And actually, just to clarify, reading this 3-issue miniseries, I was amazed by how much I didn't remember. Like, I universally have always, like, when you and I discussed this, and actually, to take it back even further, before I was even podcasting, I think, I sent you an audio Stump the Rios years ago, where one of the questions I sent you, and I knew you were going to get it, but when I did the audio, I specifically picked works that I wanted to recommend to people. So when I did the audio, I made sure that after I gave the answer, I threw in, like, why I wanted this to be a question. And I knew when I threw reference to Longbow Hunters, the answer to the question was Shadow. And it was, I don't remember what the exact question I asked, but I'm like, there's no way Peter's not going to know this. I knew that it was my giveaway to you. And I'm like, I'm giving him one. I'm not going to stump him from this, but I want to shout out Longbow Hunters. But even at that time, it had been years since I had read the series. I hadn't read it then. So it's been a long time since I've read this. This sequence that we're talking about right now, I didn't remember it. I loved the wink and the nod this time through. I didn't remember Shadow ever dressing up. I was like, where did this come from? I remembered Shadow in this, and I remembered the two of them having this, adversarial yet respect relationship. I remembered it getting really philosophical between the two of them. But I'm going to be honest with you, there's about 75% of this. As I was reading it through, I'm like, I don't remember that. I don't remember that. I didn't remember Eddie Fires being introduced in all this. There was so much of this that I didn't remember happening in this series, and a lot of Shadow's background I didn't remember. And that to me, this was like, it was really like reading it for the first time again, the first time through, preparing for this. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it, actually, because there were parts where I'm like, what? When did that happen? And this was one of those moments. I didn't remember her dressing up.
Because that was the thing, I kind of saw it coming when And what it was, and you're talking about just the jarring moment of, him getting this clue, because the thing that I kept noticing was how she was, leading Ollie along, how, every time that Ollie, comes across her, she's basically letting him see her. Like their very first confrontation when they're on the rooftop there, he's driving down and sees her go through the shadows in the alley. I took it that she wanted him to see it. She wants to control where Ollie's going to be at. kind of seeing a kindred spirit between the two, but also just it's best to, if you're being hunted by someone, to know, to keep them in place where you want them at, where you can control it. And she even later says in this issue, when they're confronted on the side of the mountain, that's basically what she did by giving him the clue. She wanted him where she knew where he would be. And I thought that was just a great, kind of throughout the whole thing. So when I saw that scene, I immediately thought it was her. And then when you get the little tattoo mark, I'm like, oh, cool, okay, yeah, I was right. And I love that because part of the whole kind of, throwing into the ninjutsu even, it is about disguise. It is about not just hiding in the shadows, it is about hiding in plain sight and blending in with your background, and the whole thing you were saying with just the urban jungle. I thought that was just a whole great usage of her and her training and just the general persona behind what she is.
It's funny, Jim, you were talking about that mountain, the Mount Rainier, or Rainier, or however you pronounce it. It was one of the things this time around. It's another thing that I didn't remember. I remembered always thinking the artwork in this was just plain gorgeous, and the color work in this was just plain gorgeous. But when we hit this sequence here on page 20 and 21 of issue 3, and you get to see this establishing shot of the mountain. This is just an establishing shot of the background scenery where Shadow and Ollie are going to have their not only their confrontation with each other, but the battle with Mangnor and Eddie Fires and the CIA and this whole little bit. Or Eddie's ex-CIA and this, I should say, Eddie's ex-CIA and then this Osborne guy, and really everything comes to a head at this point. But for an establishing shot to be this beautiful, this is a work of art. I was looking at that and I'm like, wow, anybody who, I would love to show anybody who thinks that comics are not an art form and not an artistic project and not just, this should be in a museum. This 2-page spread here, just the talent pool in comics today and in the past and whatever, what they do with their interpretation of landscapes and all that. I looked at this and I really was one of those sequence of events where I just marveled at this. The reflections on the water and the work that was done here by both Grell and the colorist, I thought was just stunning. I mean, this is a stunning piece of work contained in this Green Arrow story for an establishing shot. For something that really you don't see from this vantage point again. And I loved that he took the time to do this. It was something that, and I don't know that I at 16 years old, I appreciated this the way that I did now. Because I think I would have remembered at 16 looking at this the way I am today. And it just shows where revisiting something that, you grew up with comic-wise in your childhood is worth doing because you're going to see it from a different set of eyes now. And this was something I just really marveled at this piece because I thought it was something that was very well done.
Yeah, he put a lot of happy little trees in there.
Stop, Ross reference. I've been to Seattle now. I've been to Emerald City Comic Con, and some of especially in the establishing shots of the city where you see the marketplace. I know exactly where that corner is now. That section, which is kind of creepy and fun at the same time, because it felt like such a far away setting when I was reading it as a kid. So I love that about it. And in my mind, when it comes to the art, the things that I remember the most are the several panels where they're having a discussion and to emphasize a more serious point that they're trying to make, he does that one shot where it looks like the artwork is drawn on I don't know, like almost like paper that's used for charcoal, or where you see the surface of the paper coming through, and it looks almost like a color pencil or charcoal or something. It's a completely different look from the panels before it, and it's usually done in gray. I really loved all those moments, and it's like a comfort thing. You go back to it, and you're like, oh, wow, that's so cool. But then you're right, then it blows up into the natural stuff, and it's just amazing. I mean, this really was a really high point for Mike Grell, coming off of a lot of the stuff that he was doing before this, starting Legion of Superheroes, Warlord, which was beautiful, and then you see this, and it's amazing. I mean, the craft in this is just really amazing, and I don't know, I've never really sort of researched the original art side to all of this, but it has me interested to see how he put a lot of these pages together. What size are they? Are any of them oversized so that so they can really get a lot of the detail in the nature work. But yeah, really beautiful stuff.
This would be a great one to do absolute.
Yeah, just because it's pure art piece all the way through. I'm actually really disappointed that this isn't currently in print. It is available for anybody who hasn't read it. It's on DC's app right now. And it was funny, when I went to go find that, I had to go to actually the Comixology website, the DC website there, and I had to do a search for Longbow Hunters. I was surprised. And then I did find it. It is on the DC's app. It's under the current series of, or not the current series, it's the Kevin Smith series of the one that Kevin Smith kicked out of Green Arrow. If you look in there, you'll find Longbow Hunters issues. The 3 issues are located in there. And I did read this on, I bought them on my iPad just to see, what was it like to read this series on the app. And I enjoyed it. I think it's a really good experience to read them on the app. I liked the fact that you can tap and zoom, because you can tap on the screen and zoom into the panels, just, so you get them in the size that you would like to read them in, or maybe even a little bit larger than they would be in this format. But I was funny. I read it on the app. I'm thrilled that I have it, because this is a series that I really see myself throughout my life wanting to go back and revisit. It's worthy of that. Yet, when I go back to, I will never part ways with my prestige format issues, because there's something in the way these were constructed, and I would love to see these reprinted. It's been reprinted in a trade before, but I would love to see books like this reprinted, like you said, Jim, maybe in an absolute, or reprinted as the actual, maybe bound together in some way, like where you get them in a plastic package or something like that with all 3 of them. To be able to hold these in the prestige format and look at these wraparound covers and the way that these books were constructed at the time, Peter would reference before the $2.95, which holding the line at $2.95, right? it's amazing that going back all this time, this was a high-end issue at $2.95. At that point, that was a high price point, but you got quality. There's no ads in this. There's a huge page count in this. It's clear that this was given some form, because Peter was talking about how was this constructed. I would be curious to see not only how it was constructed, but what kind of lead time this series was given, because there's no way this was done in 30 days, an issue of this. I mean, it's not possible. The quality is just too high, too demanding, both on Grell's line work and pencils and the writing, but also the color work on this. This was clear that a lot of time was put in every piece of the process. I would love to know how long it took to put together each individual issue of this. I loved reading it on the app, so that's not a knock on it. And I do, anybody, if you don't have this series and you haven't read it, do get it off of DC's app and read it that way. But then I would also encourage, at conventions and send letters. DC's accepting letters now. In the current, Green Arrow series, send a letter in saying, hey, will you guys consider reprinting Longbow Hunters? Because they look for stuff like that. And this is a classic series that I think it's a tragedy this is not in print right now, that you can go buy a brand new trade of this. Mm-hmm. Or the single prestige issues or whatever. You can find them at conventions. It's relatively easy to find them. But I do think this is a story that deserves to stay in print. It should be on bookshelves at bookstores, should be at your comic shops. A lot of them will have them. So go to your comic shop and please check for these. But it is something that for this not to be in print is just crazy to me.
Amen. Testify. You get going sometimes and it's okay. Just let Sean go because he's on a roll.
Well, it is. I mean, I do think that there's certain comic works, like Dark Knight is always in print.
Yeah.
I mean, Dark Knight Returns, I should say, is always in print in some format. This one, I think, for just the same reasons that Dark Knight Returns, this is an era where, it's a definitive Green Arrow story.
Now, the confrontation, the head-to-head face-off when these two have, Shadow and Green Arrow have on the mountainside. Again, that was another cool dialogue moment where in the first issue you have this very loving, just couple type of romantic, personal, discussion between Ollie and Dinah. Now we have the two warriors meeting up, and it's the whole philosophy behind, is it, Ollie's like, I'm not going to let you just kill these people. It's like, hold on, you could have stopped the guy who was torturing your woman without killing him, but you didn't. And it was just that I like that little banter going back and forth. Again, it was a personalized banter between the two of them, but so completely different than what he would have with Dinah that it wasn't just an anticipation of the upcoming fight, because I never really thought those two would start shooting arrows at each other. Because of that dialogue, because of that banter, I always thought there was a mutual level of respect that they both would be, kind of going after the bad guy.
See, and I took it that Ollie didn't see what she was saying. I think he did as the conversation went on, and we do see it when he saves her, because he does save her from Eddie Fires, which lends into a whole relationship with Eddie, which I'll talk about in a little bit, because he's a very interesting character, who a bit part in this, but later, plays big factors into Green Arrow's history. I liked that she was saying to him, I'm here for my honor. I'm here to regain my honor because of what they did to my family. You're here for revenge for your woman and what was done here. And it wasn't so much about the killing at this point. It was a philosophical issue as far as why they were even there to begin with between the two of them. And it was interesting for her. It was almost like she wanted, I don't know if it was his approval as much as his understanding. Like, this was maybe the first time she was able to have a conversation on this level with anyone. And that was something I noticed this time through that I didn't connect with last time, and how important it was for her to notice his eyes and that there was something, that connection there between them. I noticed her more this time, because I think before I was so busy riding along with Ollie that I never really put myself in the role of Shadow here and what she might be looking for. And I really felt she was looking for his, not approval, understanding. Like, do you understand me? Because you should with what you're going through here. And I really liked that this time through.
And I think that's, part of the thing that I was seeing in there, where it was, I don't want to say a kindred, well, actually, yeah, she was looking for a kindred spirit. Because you think about just the way of the warrior, the way she was living. She's lived her whole life in a very, alone. And even, Ollie talks about just the loneliness of the hunter, not only even just when he was on the desert island, just that lifestyle, just the way it is. And even when you're a hero, you think about Ollie spent his birthday by himself because Dinah was working the case, even though it wasn't just because she was working the case, she had been kidnapped at that point in time, but there is a loneliness in the game. So those two kind of had the kindred spirit going in, and there was that connection.
What do you guys think about Robin Hood taking the money? This is something I didn't remember. I didn't remember him taking the money at the end. I didn't remember that aspect of it. It's another great example of, I was saying, like 75% of it I forgot, and that isn't a knock on the series. I read this when I was 16.
It's that one, for me, was a tough one, because him taking the money didn't spoil anything for my enjoyment. I actually chuckled at it. I was like, haha, kind of just that ending with, hey, I got a big raise, when he holds up the bag. But, when I sit down and I look at it, I didn't like it, because it goes again, that whole nature of the hero. That is dirty money. You think where it comes from, what it was supposed to be intended for. And I would have rather have seen him take the money and give it to the charities. Do the whole Robin Hood thing, take from the rich, give to the poor.
Well, we don't know what he's going to see, and that's something, it's never established what he's going to do with it. So, I mean, this didn't end here. So that's an interesting, and that, I think, is where there's going to be a distinction between maybe how we read this, and this really is establishing him as a Robin Hood. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, well, I read it that he took it and he kept it, and that was what he was going to live on instead of getting a job. That's how I read that story, and that just, that kind of mindset, that kind of logic, and that just what he was doing, I didn't like that. I would have rather him give it away to, the various needy causes around Seattle, charities, churches, and whatnot.
I see Jim's point. If you were just to read these issues, you're sort of left with the idea that he probably is going to keep it, right? I mean, he was talking about finding a job earlier in the story. They have a conversation about the money itself. So there is a part of me that sees that, he probably would have taken it, and that was the end of it, right? Now, knowing what's going to happen in the ongoing series, we know that's not the case. But as the story is told, does it bother me? I don't think it does. I almost see it as compensation for the hell that both these characters were sort of put through, and it's not a perfect ending, but I don't know. Maybe there was maybe he couldn't figure out what he wanted to do with the ending. It's not perfect. The ending does sort of end a little on the downside of things. It's not as fulfilling as maybe you would hope it would be, but it also doesn't bother me though either.
I'm assuming, rereading this now, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this, that this series was created knowing that there was going to be an ongoing afterwards. And I don't know that I'm right on that. I might be wrong, because it does feel like at the end, like it leaves a lot of things. Like, it ends everything with this Magnor storyline there, but it establishes Shadow as a character who is still out there. Like, there is no resolution between Ollie and Shadow, in the sense that Shadow kills Magnor at the end, after Ollie has really put him in his place, and basically said, I'm going to frame Iggy Brown's death on, because it's my word, or it's this situation's word against yours, and Magnor's like shocked by this, saying, I had all the cards here. What do you mean you're going to do this? And he's really thrown him for the loop. Ollie's playing the game. And really showing that, you can, I'm not going to play by the same rules that the police do with you or anybody else. You want to play hardball, fine, I will play back with you, and here's what I'm going to do to you because I can. And playing this political game with Magnor. And I liked how that played out. Then Shadow shoots him, and that kind of makes it all a moot point. But that doesn't end there, because she goes off, and there is that sense of they could encounter each other again in the future. And I think part of that is the fact that I knew I know now that there is an ongoing, so maybe I'm reading it differently now. I would be curious to see if the ongoing was already something in their plans when they created this series, saying, hey, let's create this 3-issue storyline with the intention that it will lead into a series if it's well received, and maybe Grell was setting it up for that series, because Eddie Fires does appear in that series. The stuff with Dinah that happens in here does play into the series. The money plays into that series. So it doesn't. These are things that you're talking about that don't end here. They do continue into the series. So this has a definitive ending, yet what's called an epilogue at the end really, to me, was more of material like leaving the door open to where do they go from here. And I don't know if I think that might be my own foreknowledge that I know that there was a series that went on all the way through Connor Hawk's time. So, that could be what's driving my thinking this time. So I don't know that I'm right. I could be way off.
Did they ever show Shadow going back to Japan and basically, reclaiming the family honor and all of everything that she went through, and ending an epilogue, if you will, for her in the ongoing series or anywhere that you guys know of?
Ooh. Well, there is a Shadow miniseries that Mike Grell wrote. It was in '92. The penciler was Michael Davis Lawrence. I don't remember the exact contents of that. I know Green Arrow was in it, and I almost want to say, I think, at the end of it, I think that's where you get the revelation. Sean, can I go into these spoilers?
No, go right ahead.
I think it's definitely where you get the revelation that Shadow and Green Arrow have a son together. They have a son. I forget what his name is, but I think you see that he has green eyes, and she's part of the ongoing series that he has, and then this miniseries then comes out later, because I was looking up when did the ongoing series start, and it started almost, probably only about 3-4 months late after the end of Longbow Hunters. I have to think, at least they probably did have some idea that they were going to start an ongoing series. When I was reading it at the time, I never got that feeling, and maybe I just missed the announcement or whatever. But the story ended for me, and that was it. Like it was a complete story for me. And then when the Shadow series came out, that was when you got the whole. Again, I can't remember what it was, but I know it did take place in Japan, and there was something about the Yakuza. Green Arrow was in it, and then eventually she meets him years later and discovers that he has a kid with her.
Now that's not Connor, right?
No.
Okay.
There was an issue of Birds of Prey, I think, or I might be wrong. It was something that Tony Bedard wrote, I believe, or something like that, where he identified Shadow as being the mother of Connor Hawk, but it was a mistake. It wasn't, a real thing that happened. It was minor. thing at the time. But no, it's not his mother. She is a character that does reappear, though, in the ongoing afterwards. It was a character who I always was incredibly interested in. I was always kind of glad that they never spun her out into her own ongoing, because that seems to be something that was always very popular with interesting characters. They always went into their own ongoing. And I always liked that she remained, while she had her own mini, and I enjoyed that. And I don't, like, I'm with you, Peter, I don't remember a lot of the content of it, but I've really liked that her appearances, rather than her having her own ongoing, she remained like kind of this enigma, kind of mysterious character, rather than doing too much with her. Because sometimes there is that danger where it's a character that is unique and interesting and has a premise where they could branch off. Like, she could have, there's multiple times where I think she could have launched into her own series and ongoing, and I'm so glad that didn't happen, because just as much as I like what we know about her, I like what I don't know. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of refreshing to have a character like this. Still to this day.
But she's very much like the Elektra to Daredevil, right? She's like Green Arrow's Elektra.
Yeah.
This character that comes out of nowhere. You could the whole ninja aspect becomes the love of his life, although it was different with Daredevil. But and then with Elektra, though, Elektra was infinitely more popular in the Marvel Universe as a character than Shadow was. So you sort of understand why they branched her out into miniseries and her own series. And but I guess with Shadow, it was just something that they kind of just kept in with the Green Arrow universe.
Eddie Fires was a character who he appears many times as Green Arrow's adversary. Then they build kind of a reluctant friendship. But it was funny, if I remember correctly, he was like a confidant to Connor Hawke in most of, if not all of, Connor Hawke's run. Like, they became very close friends throughout it. So this is a character who was launched in Longbow Hunters, but has like this rich history with Green Arrow ever since it. As a supporting character who takes on a more prominent role much later in the series afterwards. Especially that was under Chuck Dixon when he was writing a lot of Connor Hawke, which it was again a great example of where, yes, we've got a new Green Arrow, but it's Green Arrow's son, and we're acknowledging a character that was introduced in a very small role in Longbow Hunters, but then had this relationship with Holly and connects with his kid later on. So it's funny how that character was not a throwaway. He actually had quite a life after this series of events.
That only really clicked with me on this reading. I mean, I've read this a few other times in between the first time I read it and now, and even having read Eddie Fires in with Connor Hawke, it still did not connect with me, even though they name him, that was him being introduced in this. And when I read it this time, I said, whoa, wait a minute, that's Eddie. So I thought that was neat. It was a neat sort of discovery for me this time around. I said, wow, he's been around since this whole time. That's awesome.
Well, you know what it was? I hadn't read Longbow Hunters since I'd read Connor Hawke's stuff. So after you read Connor Hawke's stuff, I'm like, wait a minute, what? I was in the same boat as you. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting that this character made his first appearance here. And I had no idea. It's a great example of another thing where I had no idea. I had no idea Shadow dressed as a bag lady, and I had no idea that Eddie Fires was introduced here. So, guys, is there anything else you want to share about Longbow Hunters? Peter, is there anything else that you wanted to, where the series went, or anything that we left out that you wanted to touch on?
A couple other notes here. The covers. Again, this artwork that is on paper that you can sort of see the texture of the paper coming through. It almost looks like a painting, right? It's kind of referencing the painting. You could sort of say referencing the painting in their home. I love the first issue. All the green, the new costume right there on the front, and the back cover, and how cool that all is. The second issue with Shadow and Green Arrow. Third issue with all the nature and all that. I think the covers are, because these were milestones. These were events, and it's like, I got to read this, and look at that. It's a wraparound cover. Wow, that's awesome. Or even the chapter titles, Tracking Snow and Dragon Hunt, and on the first issue, The Hunters. And that's definitely a spillover from Dark Knight, because that had that that had chapter titles as well in that very flat gray splash chapter page. The Dark Knight had that as well. So again, you were reading something that, I guess that's why they called it the Dark Knight format, right? Because it really did sort of resemble all of that.
Peter, touching on the covers real quick, one of the things that I noticed too, just as you were, because I was looking back at them as you were talking about it. The other thing I remembered liking as a kid too, and it's something that only clicked with me now. They aren't called issue 1, issue 2, issue 3. It's not number 1, number 2, number 3. It's book 1, book 2. Book 3. And I remember going into the comic shop, and when you'd grab these, you were talking about the special nature of this format. Knowing that you were grabbing something, because we always called them issues up until when you grab something like this, and now it's book 1. I'm like, and it's funny how a word will make you as a reader think differently about it and recognize that this is something that's different. It's a little special.
Well, I mean, that definitely goes back to... I remember when in the New Teen Titans, when the Judas Contract came about, and on the cover, it said New Teen Titans, Judas Contract, Book 1, The Eyes of Kara Markov, right? Each chapter was, not only was the story arc named, which was not necessarily a new thing, but it certainly was a new thing on the cover to have a story arc named like that, to that degree. But then each chapter was named within the overarching story arc. I mean, nowadays every story arc is named, so it's kind of lost, right? New Teen Titans, the Judas Contract, what's that? Legion of Superheroes when they did the Universo project. Whenever a title got a name, so that's why this miniseries, it's never really just called the Green Hour miniseries. It's called, did you ever read Longbow Hunters, right? You go right to the title because it brings about and evokes a time and an event and an essence, the essence of the story. So, nowadays when we take all that for granted, that every story has a title and they go out of their way, it's almost like you can't even remember them anymore, You can certainly, Starman had a lot of that, with Grand Guignol or Star's My Destination.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think, like Preacher, War in the Sun, or Alamo. Those are arcs that stick out in my brain. But could I think of some other ones currently? I don't know. Like Red Robin has a bunch of them now. I can't remember what their story arc titles are, because they're not standing out as much. But back then, yeah, Longbow Hunters, that meant something. Judas Contract, that meant something. And
Death in the Family.
Yes, there you go. That's a great one. Death in the Family.
Lonely Place
Absolutely.
of Dying.
Lonely Place of Dying, yeah.
You know what it is? I think in Nightfall, I think what the distinction is, because you referenced it earlier, actually, Peter. We were talking through, we had mentioned the contest and Death of Superman. At that time, when this stuff started happening, it wasn't really common to see a lot of identification of arcs. Like, we're very used to things being done in multi-issue arcs now to be traded. So to see something with a 6-part arc title is very common. But I don't think it stands out as much because we're very used to that being the way things are now. Back in the day when this was happening, it wasn't common to see things collected. It wasn't, it was very rare. Occasionally you might see something, but it was more, you picked up the original issues, you went back issue diving, you grabbed the arc that way. So when you saw the arc named and numbered like that, it was something unusual. I think that's why they do stand out a little bit more as being something that we remember. Do you remember reading this? Because they were special moments that didn't happen as often.
Yeah, I agree.
The one thing that it was funny, just a little stupid funny moment. It was in the cemetery death scene. You see the one gravestone had Willingham on it, and there was some scribbling. So I actually pulled out a magnifying glass because I wanted to see what was written on the tombstone underneath Willingham. And it's
weird, right?
It's "Here lies Bill, who ate his fill of freeze-dried pork and beans. He didn't think and took a drink and blew out the back of his jeans. Rest in pieces." I was sitting there and I was like, that is actually, I chuckled with it. I thought it was just a little...
But is it a reference then to Bill Willingham? It must be.
I'm assuming.
Because he would have been in comics during that time.
Oh, sure.
So
doing Elementals and doing artwork here and there in the DC Universe. Yeah, I saw that for the first time, too, and was like, whoa, what's it about? Is it just him being silly? Because there's some other ones that are sort of silly, tombstones, but that one was so very specific. I was like, boy, what's that about?
And right next to it, there's a Toto one, and I'm just like, that's why I was hoping you guys would have like some knowledge of, was there something, a goofy thing going on back and forth between these guys at the time, or did they work together, or is there any backstory behind that, or because you see that every so often with creators making references to other people, and it was just, I was like, I kind of chuckled at it.
I think during that time, creators were a lot more anonymous. I think this was an era where we really started to identify people a lot more. When this series came out, I knew who Mike Grell was. That was something that I don't remember being as common, except in this era. This started to be an era where I wasn't just identifying characters, I wasn't just identifying comic companies, I was identifying creators and starting to seek them out. And I think it was something when your Alan Moores and your Frank Millers, and then, with this series when it came out, you started identifying more who some of these people were, started following their work, started following their pencils, your John Burns, you kept going through, you started to know who a lot of these creators were at the time. And I don't know if that was the same experience for you, Peter, but I do remember this was the time in my life where I was starting to get to really identify that the people were crafting these comics were people that mattered, and that if I liked one of their stories, more than likely if their name was on something else, I was going to like that too, and I should probably check it out.
Oh, yeah. I that was definitely, post-crisis, that was something that I was definitely more aware of. I had my favorites, Perez and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. I certainly knew who Byrne was. And then I just would go from there. And then, when you get something like around this time, when you get something like Justice League International with Kevin Maguire and the writers on that, and you get Doom Patrol, more for the artwork, Steve Lytle, who was doing Legion covers, but was rarely doing interiors, but then he did Doom Patrol and Legion of Superheroes, and I immediately knew who he was. I knew who Kurt Swan was. That was very familiar. So I definitely started paying more and more attention at this time.
Well, thanks for picking this one, guys. This was a fun read for me.
Guys, is there anything else that...
This is not necessarily about this issue, but or about the series. It kind of is. I actually miss the days when Dinah Lance was actually a brunette and not a blonde, because nowadays I think her hair is just dyed to be a blonde. I know it's tough to wear the wig and all that. I get that, but I like that she wasn't the standard blue-eyed, blonde-haired hero that most heroines are, or whatever. So it was cool to see her again when I opened these pages up and go, oh my God, that's right. Yes, black hair. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mike Grell. I thought that was cool. And this is a complete tangent, too. I don't know if you guys have ever talked about this miniseries, but going back to that conversation about DC taking some of their characters and moving them forward, giving them a relaunch into a new status quo based on maybe giving them a different setting or a different outlook in life or a different costume, a different personality. And it kind of is along the lines of like a Longbow Hunters or Hawk World or definitely the fall of Adam Strange. But have you guys on the show talked about the Sword of the Atom?
No. Have you read that?
I haven't read it. I'm pretty sure I have I have it, but I've never been able to sit down.
I actually bought it again in trade.
Yeah, I think when the trade came out recently, I picked it up, and I'm pretty sure I have it, but I haven't actually had a chance to sit down and read it.
Yeah, because you're going back with that one to about I want to say 83, 84 even, and for the artwork, it's Gil Kane, gorgeous artwork. And it takes this concept of, it's why I can't really necessarily subscribe to the whole, this was them just being dark and gritty and grim and gritty and writers wanting to be different with their characters, because, they were doing it even, they were sort of steering some of their characters even before Dark Knight, before Watchmen, the first book came out sort of like in mid-1983. So it's a story where Ray Palmer is having marital troubles with Jean Loring, and because of it, kind of throws himself into his science and gets wrapped up into this superhero meets Conan barbarian adventure story in South America. And it's, kind of, in some instance, it shouldn't work. It should be silly, but it actually does really work. And it's beautiful, beautiful artwork. And it has this effect of sort of changing the character for a long time, for a little bit. Not anything too major, but just, he separates from Jean, and he has a different way that he goes about his superheroics. And it did eventually spin into the series called Power of the Atom in the late 80s, which was okay. It wasn't great. But if you're ever at a point where you're looking, if you continue to look at sort of like relaunches of characters that really kind of changed the character for a certain period, check out Sword of the Atom. It was 4 issues, and then eventually they would do 3 specials that would follow it. But the first 4 issues are just, I think they're really cool. And as a 10, 11-year-old, it really got my imagination going.
It is available in trade, too. That is one that's not out of print. They reprinted it right around the time that the Ryan Choi series was going on. And they took that and recollected it. It was one of the cool things about that was you mentioned the adventure aspect. I really loved like the swashbuckling Atom, and it was a great chance to see a different side of Ray Palmer. It added another layer to Ray. Again, not ignoring his past, which was something that I appreciated about that, because it wasn't like we threw out who Ray Palmer was, or his relationship with Jean.
Yeah, and it all those people who read Identity Crisis, and I won't go into details, but they said, those things, wow, that just seems like taking characters out of, or not writing them correctly, or spinning them in a way that they've never been written before. You know what? Read some of that 70s, 80s stuff, and trust me, that is not far removed from that character at all.
No, you're right. It actually leads right into Sword of the Atom. Actually, in many ways, leads right into Identity Crisis.
Yeah,
cool.
Just about. No, I was just going to say, I'm glad you guys took a look at the book, and I know it was a little bit a different format than the way you normally go about your reviews, but I think it's that kind of book, right? The art, the words, the story blend so well that even if you've never read it and you've listened to this conversation, we gave away plot points and we gave away the ending and stuff like that, but you still can enjoy it. You can still sit down and experience it for yourself, especially if you've never seen Mike Grell artwork. This is going to be a real treat.
And I do want to touch on one thing. The app before, I wasn't trying to put it down when reading it digitally. I read it all the way through on the iPad, and honestly, I have the issue, so if I wasn't enjoying the experience, I would have stopped doing that. So for anybody who hasn't read this, the colors come out just right. It's just like having those issues. I think it's for me because I have the nostalgia of picking up these issues, from being 16 and remembering what the Prestige felt like, that I found myself, after reading it on the app, I wanted to read it again with the Prestige format issues and just to have that feeling to it. But for those of you that haven't read this before, feel free to read it on DC Digital app, which you can read on your computers as well, because it is out of print right now, and I do encourage you to read this series if you can't find it at a local shop or at a convention. This is one that's worth seeking out, though, and checking it out. And I do encourage you to, if you enjoy it, please let DC know and tell them to reprint it, because I'm going to say again, I do think this is a series that deserves to be in print, just because I think it's one of the classics, and I think it's a landmark, and it's one of those series that defines an era, and it's not one that should ever be out of print. It should be reprinted over and over again, and I can't imagine it not doing well sales-wise, just by somebody picking it off the shelf can look at it and go, especially with Green Arrow been on Smallville and all that. I mean, it's an identifiable name, not just to fans of comics, but also outside of comics who are looking at the bookshelves. Peter, I want to thank you for joining us today, and especially after all the time it took to put this together, especially for this series, because it's something that for me, when you originally suggested, I'm like, oh, that is so cool, because it's kind of cyclical with the fact that as a fan of your podcast, I called in and sent you guys an audio submission over this series way back when, and to come back years later and do this now on our show as a full-blown review is kind of poetic that it's with you, and to have you on the show to discuss this book with your love for DC and these characters, knowing that I gave you one for this one. Peter's on, if you're insane and not listening to Comic Geek Speak, it's comicgeekspeak.com. I wouldn't be podcasting if it wasn't for Comic Geek Speak and Peter and Brian and the whole gang. It's a show for me. When you podcast, the last thing in the world you listen to is your own show. You listen to shows that you appreciate. And I wouldn't be a podcaster if it wasn't for your podcast and your guys' love for comics and the quality program that you guys put out. And honestly, your help, as I've shared many times on the show, with helping me get into podcasting, and your friendship and support. And I really have appreciated that throughout the years. But I remain a huge fan of Comic Geek Speak. I listen to every episode. I love the show. And it's comicgeekspeak.com if you aren't listening to it. There's links on our website to it. We are a member of your forum community. Anything about Comic Geek Speak you want to shout out?
We do our convention tour. I don't know where it'll fall. We may be heading to Heroes, or we might have already been at Heroes. We'll be up at Fan Expo, I should say. I just want to say, Sean and Jim, you guys were missed at Super Show, and there were a lot of people who mentioned your names, and there was one guy who came up to me at the ticket booth, at ticket counter actually, and they said, "Are the guys from Raging Bullets here?" And I said, "No, they couldn't make it this year." And you guys were absolutely missed at the show because you guys are family now, and you've always been. So that was when you have a family reunion like that, and one of your family members is not there, it kind of leaves an empty hole. So you were definitely missed there. It was great to see you out at C2E2, and I'm sure we'll see each other again eventually, on the road. I love coming on to talk about DC. You know where my heart lies. So this has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for putting up with all the technical stuff and all that. And you know where we are. We'll be in touch again.
And one thing I will say for fans of Super Show, I will definitely be at next year's. This year was a fluke. I had flooding in my base, which I've shared on the show for listeners, and on our website when it happened. I had every intention of being at Super Show. I'm so mad that I broke my streak because I've been at every CGS. This is the only CGS event I've ever missed. So for me, I was very upset to not be, because I was at the first, and to have missed one and to break my streak more than anything else. That bugged me.
And I had my godson's first communion, so it was one of those things where I had no choice. It was you got to be there. So
by hook or by crook, I will definitely be at next year's, and it's an event I always look forward to. And remember, comicgeekspeak.com if you want to find out anything about Comic Geek Speak. I know you guys. You have an incredible website, also available on iTunes, all of your favorite podcatchers and things like that. So make sure that you're checking out Comic Geek Speak.
Thank you very much.
Reaching melting point. Not sure we can make it.
Our next episode, Flashpoint. We're going to be taking a look at all of the tie-in miniseries. We're going to be taking a look at the current miniseries, everything that's been released so far, and do kind of an in-depth look at those and what we're enjoying, what we think about this new world, and also, obviously, we're not going to be able to help but discuss some of the news about the 52 books that have been revealed for September, as DC's doing it, I don't know if relaunch, reboot, I don't know what to call it, but this reimagining that DC's doing that's going to be coming out, and what we're excited about, and maybe also some of the books that make us maybe a little bit on edge right now, kind of wondering where the direction of these characters are going to be. So it's kind of fun to talk about that on that episode. So that's going to be next week. We also have some listener voicemails that we'll be playing on the show as well. So there's some time to call in if you want to be a part of that. Remember, our show voicemail line is 1-440-388-4434 or Dr. Norge on Skype. So please, we love having you a part of the show, and please consider calling in. Once again, sponsoring us this episode is DCBService.com, Legends of the Dark Knight, Marshall Rogers hardcover, $49.99 regularly, 50% off, only $24.99. And I want to thank DCBService.com for continuing to support the show and providing these amazing pre-order deals. Over at InStockTrades.com, Green Arrow Year 1 hardcover, Andy Diggle Jock, $24.99 regularly, 38% off, only $15.49. Be sure to check out InStockTrades.com and browse around for their amazing array of collected editions. Thank you very much, InStockTrades.com, for supporting the show. I also want to remind everyone about the Summit City Comic Con. That's SummitCityComicCon.com. Last episode, we played a great promo talking about that wonderful convention. If you haven't had a chance, it's coming up this month. So it's SummitCityComicCon.com. We will see everyone next week.
Bye.
Flying through space and time, 1,000 different lifetimes. Faded for love and flaws and incredibly clear sightlines. Swinging your mace around, such a practical outlook. Helping the JSA and occasionally supporting your own book. Hawkman, Hawkman. Eagle eyes can't see. Hawkman, your plan. And what you do to me, Hawkman. The villains are closing in, be they Thanin Guard or Egyptian. Working so hard to thwart you and Hawkgirl's mission. The odds are not on your side, and danger seems to stack up.